Hello and welcome to everybody here. This is going to be the first session of our seminar, Limits to Decolonial Reason. And here I'm going to be presenting the description of the course. The seminar assesses the major conceptual contributions and limitations of the so-called modernity-coloniality movement in Latin America from a philosophical standpoint. It examines the major thesis elaborated by this movement while diagnosing the internal fissures that open decolonial thought beyond the original tenets adopted by its foundational figures and their guiding methodological structures. Above all, the seminar explores the purported extension of the critique of Eurocentric reason advanced by historicist thinkers since the 1940s and by the philosophy of liberation since the 1970s to interrogate the methodological foundations of Western epistemology and occidentalism in its complicity with the coloniality of knowing and power that accompanies the institution of the modern world system as described by Immanuel Wallerstein. The seminar is presented by Daniel Sacilotto. He teaches in the critical studies at the California Institute of the Arts and in the arts design at California State University, San Bernardino. His research focuses on the relation between realism and utopianism in contemporary European philosophy and post-colonial Latin America. He is the author of Universality and Utopia, the 20th century Peruvian socialist indigenista tradition, Structure and Thought towards a Theory of Representational Cognition. And with that, we talked about that, Daniel. For this seminar, the class's presentation, because of the size, will be presentations that will be recorded by the seminar students, and then you can upload them to the drive. We won't have in-class presentations. And from there, I think I can pass it on to Daniel to start the seminar.
Thank you, Luis. Pleasure. Hello, everybody. How's everyone doing? I see a few familiar faces here, some very old familiar faces, and some new ones, lots of new ones. Hopefully, most people will activate their cameras. Hello, everybody. Because this first session is public, we're not going to do introductions today, but we will do introductions proper next time, because I do want to hear about you guys and know who's attending. Today, as stated in the syllabus, I will not be rehearsing the syllabus as contents, but will be just briefly introducing the course today. I will spend most of today actually providing a kind of historical and conceptual background to the theme of the seminar. This is not a seminar that is supposed to be a kind of introduction to decolonial theory or to the modernity-coloniality movement as such. It is supposed to be a philosophical assessment of that movement. What that means is that rather than an attempt to survey exhaustively, which would be impossible, incidentally, in 4 weeks, the contributions of this movement, what I will be trying to do is to approach the central concepts that framed the decolonial turn as a kind of fundamentally epistemological enterprise. And I will be speaking more about what that means, what the implications of that, epistemological focus entails. The primary motivation for the seminar, as I will go into in a moment, stems out of a book research project, which I am now very close to having finished, which I'll describe to you in some detail in a little bit, so you understand a little bit better what the general impetus behind this project. But also my central sort of intention is to frame the modernity decoloniality movement and the decolonial turn a little bit more broadly in Latin America as part of a tradition of Latin Americanist thought that sometimes is not very well understood, because it so happens that most of us, even in Latin America, those of us who grew in Latin America, when we take courses, say, on philosophy or theory, very seldom do we encounter, a deep engagement with our own canon, with our own tradition. And because of that, I think sometimes we tend to lose the continuity that genealogically binds the coloniality and the decolonial turn to its precursors. So I will be speaking a little bit about these precursors, and specifically about three precursors, although briefly, of course, because of introductory purposes. And those three precursors are the indigenista moment of the 1920s, and above all, the work of José Carlos Mariátegui, and the 1928 publication of the seven interpretative essays on Peruvian reality, which become a clear point of influence for Aníbal Quijano. The second is the historicist moment in Latin American thought, which was a moment in which philosophy acquires a measure of disciplinary self-consciousness between the 1940s and 1960s, and particularly in Mexico through the work of people like José Gao San Leopoldo Sea. Finally, the liberationist moment, the philosophy of liberation, although more broadly speaking, the so-called liberationist thought that encompasses the pedagogy of liberation of Paulo Freire, the theology of liberation, and also the philosophy of liberation, focusing, of course, and this is one of our readings, hopefully you guys got to around these, Enrique Dussel, of which I've spoken many times before, including in my former seminar in which I introduced the book project that at the time was still in diapers, as it said. So the agenda for today will be basically, first, I will try to introduce this historical context, first by framing it within the general project of the book that I am completing at present. Second, by giving this broader historical constellation of precursors or positions, and then moving towards the materials that open up and introduce us to the modernity-coloniality group in particular, beginning, of course, with the work, the foundational work, I should say, of Aníbal Quijano, who, of course, I think, we will probably continue to talk about him, not only next session, but throughout the seminar, since these concepts are really the foundation for the rest of the constellation that we will be talking about. On the weeks to come, that is to say, weeks 2, 3, and 4, we will be focusing on very select, because only time allows for so much, right? Authors and moments of the modernity-coloniality movement and group. And I try to identify certain points of importance, but also tension within this group. As any kind of intellectual movement or think tank, there are fissures within this group that make it very difficult to reify or totalize our conception of it. And so in the second week, we will be looking at, as you probably surmised from the syllabus and the introduction, the work of Walter Mignolo, Catherine Walsh in particular, and Ramon Grosfoguel from Puerto Rico. And all of these thinkers, as we will see, who are very much nested in the American academic system, propose a conception of what they call gnosiological critique. Particularly, this is a term that Mignolo himself developed and becomes prevalent in his arguably second or first most important work, Local Histories, Global Designs. But this concept proposes a transvaluation of Western epistemologies through the rehabilitation of what he will call border thinking or non-Western gnosis. And those are technical concepts. You don't have to worry about that right now. On the third week, we will be focusing on an alternative trajectory that in a certain way resists some of the most, let's say, deflationary and critical aspects of the trajectory presented or represented by Mignolo, Walsh, and Grosfoguel. And as we will see, this fissure and disagreement largely concerns the way that modernity is understood and how the prospects of modernity for not only the continent of Latin America, but more broadly as a kind of global design, to use Mignolo's own terms, becomes extended and reiterated as presumably a natural, inextricable corollary to coloniality. One of the central theses, as we're going to see, presented by the modernity-coloniality movement, thus the term or the name for the movement, is that these two concepts, modernity and coloniality, cannot be pulled apart. That there's a kind of intrinsic dependency between the two, not only factual, historical dependency, that is to say that these two things developed in parallel or in coordination, but that furthermore, in a certain way, it is not possible to pull them apart. So that prospects for what some would call alternative modernities, right, which is a concept that I presume many of you might be familiar with, are themselves suspect or are to be actually radicalized in an interrogation of what the desire for modernity or the prescription of modernity truly entails. The normativity implied in the idea that modernity is a horizon toward which humanity naturally converges is one of the tenets that the thinkers of the modernity-coloniality movement will challenge. But at the same time, there will be different reactions to this challenge to modernity as a normative horizon. And on the third week, we will see this challenge precisely to the most radical version of this critique. And in the final week, I propose to see a new version of decolonial thinking that actually purports to align the concept of modernity, a new alternative but so-called absolute modernity, to a decolonial vision and thought by the new program sketched by the Argentine philosopher Gabriel Catren. And I will try to be reading aspects or parts of his book Pleromática, which is a relatively new, massive, systematic work of philosophy that on the surface has very little to do with Latin Americanism as such, or decolonial theory even, but I think belongs squarely to a long tradition of Latin Americanist thought in which the decolonial impetus is ingrained. And in fact, I will be speaking a little bit about what that tradition is, the originary tradition of Latin Americanism from which the decolonial turn stems originally and within which it must be understood today, retroactively although. So that's the agenda for today. It will be, of course, largely pedagogical in nature since it's introductory. I do, however, have no problem being interrupted or having people ask questions at any time or jump in with ideas or any kind of needs for clarification. So if you do, as I'm moving forward, please just place a little yellow hand or whatever it is, right? Like the drill, right? All of you are creatures of the post-COVID era, so you know how to deal with this. So is this clear? Is that an acceptable blueprint, roadmap? Does this seem okay? Cool. So those of you who, there's a couple of comments in the chat. I will be stopping periodically, of course, to also ask people like, and everything clear, and also to check the chat. Cool. And also, if people don't have a working camera today, that's fine. It's at the end of the day your prerogative whether you want to be, seen or not. But it would be nice to, have to not be talking to a black, thumbnail with some white fonts. So it's always the more the merrier. Let me try to project. I have a PowerPoint. Those of you who know me know that I like to use this amply in my. Also, can everybody hear me all right? Is the audio acceptable, clear? Everything's good. Great, phenomenal. Okay, so let me begin properly speaking after this elevator pitch sort of summary and introduction. Limits of Decolonial Reason is the title of the class, of course, modernity, coloniality, and gnosiological critique. These three concepts, modernity, coloniality, and gnosiological critique, are going to be the focus of the so-called philosophical approximation to the tradition that we will be discussing. But before talking about this tradition in particular, I am going to be framing the scope of this seminar and what makes it unique. Again, this is not an introduction to modernity, coloniality, or decolonial theory. It is supposed to be a philosophical assessment of this tradition by focusing on a few select exemplars. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this seminar really begins from a sort of a book project that is currently underway and now finally close to being finished. It's a long book. It's titled The Flight of Ariel, Universality and Transcultural Synthesis in the New World. And it is a book in which I propose to examine the long tradition of so-called Latin American universalisms in 20th century philosophy. Latin American universalisms pertain to a tradition that has been identified, I think, for the first time by the Colombian philosopher Fernando Salamea in a book that unfortunately it's not translated nor very well read even in Spanish among Latin Americanists. This book is titled Ariel y Arizbe, Evolución y Evaluación del Concepto de América Latina en el siglo XX. Ariel and Arizbe, Evolution and Evaluation of the Concept of Latin America in the 20th Century. It was published in the year 2000. And my central thesis, or my central interpretation of this universalist tradition, which stems all the way back from Andrés Bello and José Enrique Rodó, all the way until the present, is that Latin American universalisms propose a model of what I call absolute transculturation. Absolute transculturation is a different way to speak of what I also call unrestricted transcultural synthesis. And this unrestricted transcultural synthesis elevates the concept of mestizaje from a purely ethnic register into a kind of general humanist cosmopolitan project for society, a utopian vision for society and for humanity as a whole. Now, it has different figurations and iterations. I will not get in terrible detail about what these figurations are. That's a different topic. But that in any case, all of these different visions, utopian, humanist, cosmopolitan visions, are presented as an alternative to the derelictions of European modernity and to the shadow of colonialism. So there's this kind of new cosmopolitan project presented within Latin America, by Latin America, and for which Latin America appears to be uniquely attuned. And this prospect for a new cosmopolitan humanist culture serves as a template for civilization as a whole, for humanity as a whole. So it is, from its origins, a kind of post-colonial or postmodern project or transmodern project. And this is a concept to which I will return later when we talk about the Dussel essay, Beyond Eurocentrism. The concept of transmodernity is one which thinkers in the decolonial movement, decolonial thinkers have appropriated quite strongly. And what this means, we'll have to stop and assess. But as we will see, there is a kind of still, even though decolonial thinkers oftentimes challenge universalisms or universalism as a corollary of Eurocentric ideology, philosophy, thought, nevertheless, even when they proclaim to advance a kind of pluriversal perspective, say, right, like it is the case with Mignolo, with Walsh, with Escobar, with others, there is nevertheless something like a universal perspective. And I know that that seems to be almost like, rejecting what they're saying, but I think it will become clear why I say what I say. Now, I mentioned that the central thesis that I propose is that Latin American universalisms propose a model of what I call absolute transculturation. And I presume that most people here that have some familiarity with Latin America and maybe some other, fields of cultural study might have heard the term transculturation. The term transculturation was originally developed by the Cuban anthropologist Fernando Ortiz in 1940 in a very famous work, Contrapunteo Cubano del Tabaco y el Azúcar. But it was subsequently theorized by a variety of theorists, mostly in literary criticism and literary theory, famously by Ángel Rama, who used the term to describe indigenista literature as narratives of transculturation, and subsequently more broadly to assess different artistic movements in Latin America in which ethnic and cultural encounters or processes of what sometimes is called cultural hybridity were conceived. Silvia Spita, for example. And in this original sense, in which transculturation is a process that takes place in Latin America since its origins, right? Mestizaje, cultural hybridity, the encounter between disparate cultural forms. It has three constitutive dimensions that Fernando Ortiz originally identifies. And those are the three dimensions that I identify in this slide. The first dimension is what he names deculturation. So transculturation implies that a colonized culture loses some of its traits as a result of the encounter with a colonizer culture. The colonized culture loses some of the traits or its distinctive traditions, if you will, as a result of this encounter with a domineering colonizer. There's also the flip side of this process, which is called acculturation, which is how the colonized culture acquires traits from the colonizer, right? It's not very difficult to think about, how processes of this kind occur. Predominantly, the classical example is religion, right? How evangelization, forced conversion, wrests populations, groups, families, and individuals from their traditional milieus of belief or cosmological, let's say, worldviews, and become a steeped, integrated force sometimes, right, into the Western Christian worldview, right, as a result of the colonial process. But there's this third thing, which is neoculturation, which is the most interesting part, which is that the encounter between colonizer and colonized presumably engenders, as a result of the encounter, new forms of cultural expression that did not exist before, that are neither from the colonizer or the colonized, right? This is what is also sometimes described as cultural hybridity. Now, this is a relative transculturation, as I call it, because obviously it is locally circumscribed to the specific relations between colonizer and colonized in their specific configuration, geopolitical, geographical, cultural, linguistic, et cetera, et cetera. And now one you might be asking, well, what else could it be? Transculturation isn't necessarily a localized process that takes place always in this way. But I want to say that there's another thing, or a bigger concept at work. And it's an ideal concept that orients this tradition of universalist thought in Latin America that I want to speak about. So in contrast to these local processes of transculturation that are always asymmetrical relations between colonizer and colonized, right? Now, there is another model of transculturation, which Latin Americanist thinkers since the 20th century begin to envisage. And in fact, it's already sort of anticipated in Bolívar himself, in what he calls el sueño del universo, or la esperanza del universo, to be more precise, la esperanza del universo. And this is the idea of a cosmopolitan encounter between cultures that somehow would engender a kind of cultural hybridity that would at the same time preserve the distinctive traits of each culture while potentiating the production of new cultural traits, generating at the limit, at the end of the story, at the end of the road, as it were, a kind of cosmopolitan, democratic, universalist culture that enjoyed, right, and this is obviously utopian ideal, the fruits, the characteristics, the traits of every possible culture. Perhaps the most clear expression of this sentiment in Latin America, in my opinion, can be traced back to the early 20th century and to the work of the Athenaeum of Mexico between 1909 and 1914 in the aftermath or wake of the Mexican Revolution, to the thinking of Pedro Enríquez Ureña and to the American utopia, la Utopía Americana, in which Pedro Enríquez Ureña announces the arrival of universal man. The other thinkers of the Athenaeum also proposed this precise model of radical mestizaje, elevated beyond the purely ethnic register, but as a kind of cosmopolitan civilization, imagined at the limit as a kind of humanist, complete integration of the globe and of humanity, both at the ethnic and cultural levels. For example, in the work of José Vasconcelos. So here are two diagrams that are, I think, representations, formal representations of the two models of transculturation that I have proposed. Relative transculturation encompassing the three relations that I mentioned, neoculturation, deculturation, and acculturation. Hopefully this is clear and self-explanatory. The second model is, of course, a model of transculturation. Now, I'm not gonna try to break this down. It would take far too long. This is just to sort of give you a kind of visual cue, hopefully, just to have some kind of like, reminder or something to help you. But of course, I can share these things with you if you ask for them afterwards. What I wanted to emphasize before moving forward is simply that, as you can tell, in the model of absolute transculturation, right, there is a relationship of preservation within cultures that is not hierarchical or vertical in the same sense as relative transculturation is. In relative transculturation, you always have a relation between a culture that is colonized or colonizer, and the result of the encounter between the two, between the asymmetrical relation between the two, yields the new culture, C3 in the first diagram. Whereas in absolute transculturation, you have a kind of distributed network-like non-hierarchical process of cultural synthesis that yields this at the limit again, CN, which is the, of course, ideal culture, the endpoint of cultural synthesis, of unrestricted transcultural synthesis. We have a short question, and Pradeep asked, how is absolute transculturation different from pragmatic secularism? Well, as we will see, actually, and this is very, very, very palpable in the case of Gabriel Catrin in particular, who very explicitly uses the idea of a kind of absolute modernity that is also a kind of cosmopolitan humanist vision. It is actually against secularization. There is the idea of a rehabilitation of religion, but of a quote unquote secularized religion that is actually mortgaged through not only a kind of very strange rereading of Christianity and the Christian Trinitarian, let's say, legacy, but also vitalist philosophy, which influenced quite strongly the first sequence of universalist thinking in Latin America, beginning with Rodó, the thinkers of the Athenaeum of the Youth, who were very much steeped and drenched in Bergson. Bergson was really important at the beginning of the 20th century for a generation of thinkers that were trying to get away from positivism and from this kind of more secular and even the pragmatist, like sort of, let's say, orientations of thought that were coming from the North as a kind of like assertion of autonomy. And I'll say a word about that in a second. So hopefully these two models are somewhat clear. Obviously, there's much more that would need to be said to me, these things like understand. But the last thing I will say about this transculturation business, since I'm going to be referring back to it, is that absolute transculturation encompasses invariably processes of relative transculturation, right? So what I'm trying to say is that absolute transculturation is foreseen or imagined as a kind of limit possibility that is underway, it takes place. So all these local processes of transculturation ultimately converge in a kind of consolidation of this kind of universal cosmopolitan culture. Latin American universalists believed. I think the ideal failed, but it's something like a Kantian idea. Kant postulates, for example, ideas of reason as regulative ideals. The idea, for example, the world, right? Being able to understand the world as a whole. Ideas of reason are regulative ideals in the same way as for Latin Americanist universalists, the possibility of a cosmopolitan civilization is a asymptotic limit concept that regulates the activity of transculturation as a concrete practice of cultural hybridity in the continent, and not only in the continent, but between Latin America and the rest of the world. There are other two comments very quickly here. Let me see. Leonardo says, all these processes can occur at the same time. There's some kind of chronological aspect or happening or appearing in each one of them. And then Giuseppe said, how does absolute transculturation take into account the intersection of economic inequalities between cultures within the plane of culture? Great questions too. So Leonardo, so the first, there is a chronological dimension insofar as I just said, absolute transculturation encompasses and presupposes processes of relative transculturation. So there's a practical demand, which is programmatic, legal, that you can see very much, for example, in the attempts of the Athenaeum of the Youth, people like Vasconcelos, San Antonio Caso, to try to wager and to forge an educational reform program, to build a new university, American university in the model of José Martí, that would displace the old European university and that would be conducive to the fostering of these kinds of cosmopolitan values, even though they were very much Hellenocentric and Greek-centric. They believed that, Latin America were the heirs of Greek civilization, but that's a story for another time. So there is absolutely a kind of diachronic and practical dimension. So absolute transculturalization is an ideal, and this ideal requires that we in the here and now construct institutions, processes, participate in local moments of transculturation. So there's no absolute transculturation without the integration of these processes of relative transculturation, right? Which are the real, let's say, actual filth in which we are. In the second, Giuseppe, how does absolute transculturation take into account the intersection of economic inequalities between cultures within the plane of culture? So the question of economic inequality in particular begins to become crystallized more clearly since the 1920s in what I call the second figuration of the Latin American as universalist movement, which is precisely its indigenista precursors. This, of course, will become, once it's there, central to the conversation and central to how thinkers will conceive of these different utopian projects. But I think it acquires a kind of central role beginning in the 1920s, particularly through the work of Mariátegui, who obviously takes a Marxian approach in order to understand the evolution of Latin American history, the Andes in particular, though, as shaped by the dynamics of class struggle and, of course, of a kind of historical materialist reading of history. And therefore, the emphasis he lays against the kind of idealist, more quote unquote romantic tendencies that came from before in the early Latin Americanist universalist project of the early 20th century with people like Rodó, the thinkers of the Athenaeum, and so on. Leonardo said, yes, I was thinking about both of them, Martí and Vasconcelos. Yes, so you totally you got exactly what I was talking about. All right, let me move forward a little bit. So what is at stake in general in all of these like universalist programs is, I think, fundamentally a kind of radicalization of the concept of independence. Independence from colonial rule, of course, as you know, was mostly achieved in the colonies, in the former colonies by 1830, barring, of course, the cases of Cuba, Puerto Rico. But nevertheless, there is the sense that independence requires more than simply declaring oneself to be a republic or nation state in autonomy of colonial rule. And this is going to be obviously very central to the distinction that the modernity-coloniality movement is going to draw between colonialism and coloniality. That distinction pertains to the fact that just because you become a nation state, say, right, that doesn't mean that you've achieved true independence, right? Because there is, of course, a lingering, as the early exemplars of the Latin American universalist movement like Rodó, and even before them, members of the civilizing project like Sarmiento said, mental dependency and cultural dependency. You can be your own nation, but you can still be economically dependent on the hegemonic powers that be. You can be mentally dependent in the sense that you reproduce the language, the belief systems, the art, the culture of the oppressors and the colonized, right? And one of the things that I presume is that one of the perpetual traumas of Latin American thinkers is, how is it that Latin America can find a destiny for itself, autonomous, in relation to the geopolitical centers of the world, not only Western Northern Europe, but the United States, a true culture, civilization, destiny, prosperity that would be its own, without merely imitating that which has come to itself from without merely repositioning itself in a dependent or, as we will see, peripheral position. These concepts have a specific meaning that, as we will see, come in particular with full force in the 1970s with the influx of so-called dependency theory, which is central to the philosophy of liberation. The other thing that this trajectory does is that it proposes a compatibilization between two things that we normally think are positioned against one another, and that is realism and utopianism. This is another central claim of my book and of my reading of this history. And that is to say, normally, of course, we think realism is like looking at the facts of history, of social reality with whatever tools you have. Utopianism is somehow like this kind of ideal projection, imaginary, impossible, blah, 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 right? But actually, as you see, throughout this history, these two things go hand in hand, because Latin American thinkers will propose, on the one hand, that in order to actually achieve independence, this radical independence, cultural independence, mental independence, they needed tools, theoretical tools, to understand their own past and social reality adequately, something that had not been possible because of idealizations, distortions, because they had always seen themselves through the eyes of the other, et cetera, et cetera. But that this task of appropriation or interpretation or self-consciousness was preparatory or necessary in order to forge an open and authentic emancipatory horizon for itself. So theory conditions practice. There's a precondition of self-understanding that is required in order to achieve emancipation. The emancipation, of course, that I've been speaking of as that of achieving a truly independent Latin America that's also a model for civilization as a whole, a humanist model for civilization. India asked, my question is, how do we account for these processes, transculturation, when taking into consideration late European immigration to Latin America in the 19th and beginning of 20th century? We consider the European immigrants a colonizing culture. They are a colonizing culture, sense of response. Well, I think there's no monolithic answer, because I mean, it would be, I think, simply, at least tendentious to say that every single European who emigrated, right, was necessarily a colonizer. I mean, one can think, and we will talk about this today, about the role, for example, in the 1930s of the Transterrados from Spain that brought, yes, ideas from Europe, from Spain, the father, mother, colonizer country, but who brought the ideas of Ortega y Gasset, the historicist sort of like points of reference from which Latin American historicism grew, and without which the philosophy of liberation would have been impossible to conceive. So in a certain sense, you can say, well, yes, it was like, once again, bringing these kinds of foreign reference, theoretical, philosophical, to for Latin Americans to interpret themselves through the eyes of others. And that's a fair, I think, sort of criticism to make. But nevertheless, is it a kind of, recolonization? Do we go that far? I mean, that's also, I think, a question of whether any kind of gesture of dependency or vicarious use of foreign theories is by default a gesture of accepting or submitting your, oneself to colonialism or to coloniality in any case. There's more comments here. Los Transterrados. Oh, yes. Sensa, thank you for this. I believe there could be in the south of Brazil, they kept even their language and invaded indigenous territory. So that was my thought. Well, yes, I mean, certainly there could be, and there are many examples of what you're describing. I'm just saying that maybe not necessarily in every case, right? So there's some wiggle room perhaps for nuancing the picture of the role of immigrants from without. So those are the general indications. And the very last thing to say about the general project is that this sequence of let's say models for universality that are proposed in this long tradition, which begins, as I mentioned, in the early 20th century, are also philosophically, and now we get to philosophy more proper, also different foundationalist models. Foundationalism and philosophy, long story short, for those of you who are not terribly familiar, are attempts to try to find a principle, a concept, something that can work as a kind of methodological ground or guiding, let's say, presupposition, an axiom, if you will, to use a sort of mathematical analogy, from which the rest of the theory, its interpretational mechanisms, its hermeneutic reach, its explanatory goals and desideratum, and so on, are naturally, let's say, to follow. And different iterations of this kind of project continue in this by proposing different kinds of foundations. And one of the questions we'll see is how these foundations lead us to the decolonial turn right now. There's a couple more comments here. Let me see. Okay, thank you, Doug. So this project draws very heavily from three sources, and one of them will feature very, very strongly today because it's going to be how I trace the immediate genealogy leading to modernity-coloniality. The first one is the dialectic of Latin American projects from the colonial period and until the present, well, until the late 20th century, let's say, developed by Leopoldo Sea. And this is a genealogy of projects, as he calls it, that culminates in the so-called assumptive project of the 20th century. I will say a few more things about that in a second. The second source is the generational division of Hispanic American philosophy in the 20th century by Francisco Miro Quesada, another Peruvian philosopher, into three groups: patriarchs, forgers, and disciples. This typology pertains to philosophy in particular, and it's an extension of a very old debate and series of typologies that were proposed by philosophers first in Argentina and then in other parts of the continent, where the question of the normalization of philosophy in the continent became central and for the first time sort of a kind of continental theme. The question, in other words, what do we need to do, us Latin Americans, to make philosophy authentically, originally? What's missing? Institution, how do we normalize the practice of philosophy in our universities, in our academic environment, in our professional intellectual life, like in other parts of the world it has been done? This was a very important debate, as we will see, that is actually extremely relevant to understand where the modernity-coloniality movement stems from. And the third, which I already mentioned, is this genealogy of Latin American universalisms developed by Fernando Salamea, the Colombian philosopher and mathematician, who emphasizes this utopian and transmodern orientation of Latin American thought as its most distinctive trait. Latin America is a place of synthesis, he says. It's a place defined by drawing links and diagonals. And he uses Peirce's logic, formal logic, to diagrammatic logic to think of these relationships in kind of crazy ways. So let me say a few things about briefly the genealogy from Sea. I'm gonna go very fast here, so forgive me for historical cursoriness. But perhaps I should stop here for 1 second since I've been going on for a little bit. So all good so far? Are we? Yes? Bien? Todo bien? Okay, so then we can keep moving.
Yeah, I just had one quick question. I'm sure you were coming to that. But
Yeah.
when was this debate about the philosophical typologies? Like, what
Mhm.
time period did this start from?
It began in the 1940s. The biggest figure here is Francisco Romero, who is an Argentine philosopher. He coined the term normalization, or he spoke of the normalization of philosophy in the academy as an academic responsibility. And he described how it is that in order to achieve that, what we essentially needed to do, Latin Americans, that is to have a kind of generation of people, or maybe a couple of people who trained really hard on just the history of philosophy. And then these are called the forgers, right? Then they pass over this knowledge to a generation of disciples. The disciples begin to think, of philosophy now in a kind of more original manner, now equipped with the resources. And then the disciples of the disciples finally get to produce philosophy. So it's a transgenerational task, but it's also an academic task. And there's a group of people that are the people that we are going to be concerned with that are going to say that's not the model. That's not how philosophy should operate in the continent. That alternative trajectory is where the decolonial turn is going to stem from, I think. And we're going to see that lineage in short. Okay, let me move on. Let me return to this. Okay, so I mentioned that Leopoldo Sea draws this genealogy of projects in Latin American history, beginning with the colonial period. Thus, the first project is the 16th century colonial project, the colonial venture, of course, of the Iberian Empire across the Atlantic, which inaugurates, as we will see, according to Dussel and the people from the decolonial turn, the modern world system. So that really, this history begins in 1492 with the Age of Discovery, or with, as Edmundo Orman would say, who is also another of the big historicists who wrote alongside the time of Leopoldo Sea, the invention of the Americas. And this was a very clear scholastic project in philosophical note, the imposition of scholasticism as a primary mode through La Escuela de Salamanca, through the evangelization process and the extension of Christianity in the colonies, and the cultural norms of the European Renaissance that were applied or transposed or exported to the colonial soil. And it implied a very clear erasure, suppression, subjugation, exploitation, and conquest of the Amerindian and Mesoamerican worlds. The second was the Project of Liberty, the 18th century project of independence, in which, as most people know, and this is a narrative, by the way, that has been challenged more recently by many people like Elias Palti, historians who say that this kind of idea that the revolutionaries of the 18th century were informed by the ideas of enlightenment, going against the kind of like retrograde scholasticism of the colonial rule of the Iberian Empire, that this is not exactly as tidy as one would like to think, but nevertheless, this is the way Sea paints it out. That the abolition of the colonial past passed through an alignment with the ideals of the European Enlightenment at a point in which the axis of power had shifted from the Mediterranean to Northern and Western Europe, with Britain, France, Germany as the new centers of intellectual but also geopolitical production. This alignment with the ideals of enlightenment was not only a matter of theoretical, let's say, inspiration, but it was also very much overtly, Sea argues, an attempt to try to forge an alliance and to encourage these rising powers in Europe to support the independentist cause in Latin America against the Iberian rule. For what? For obviously not only achieving autonomy in romantic terms. This isn't, nobody should be naive enough to think, no, what they wanted is to open maritime trade and to have actual free and autonomy to actually, let's say, cut severe ties to the aging serpent, as Rodó calls it, or actually as Bolivar already calls it, that aging serpent, Spain, right? The decaying empire. They wanted to actually, align themselves with the prosperous Western European powers. And at this moment is when ideas of Enlightenment philosophy and politics begin to come into the continent. It unleashes a kind of process of post-independence chaos and turmoil. The nascent republics of Latin America, as Bolivar anticipated, are caught in this kind of perpetual, let's say, tussle. And the prospects of a unified Latin America that could somehow consolidate itself as a power in the globe, capable of matching, competing with the rest, with Western Northern Europe, with the United States, does not come about because of this chaos and institutional precarity. Bolivar sword always going after the snake, the aging serpent indeed, yes. So that's the second project. Presumably we're all familiar with this protracted history. The third project, though, is where things get a little bit more interesting in Sea's genealogy, and this is what he calls the civilizing project of the mid-late 19th century. Above all, this is emblemized by the so-called generation of 1838, mostly concentrated in El Río de la Plata, Alberdi, Echeverría, Sarmiento, Lastarria, from Chile, Lastarria, the case. And in this moment, what happens is a kind of radicalized anti-Iberian impulse. Here, you see for the first time the definition of this radicalized concept of independence, where these people start to speak about so-called mental independence and not just geopolitical independence. We need to emancipate ourselves from the mental habits that have been inherited from Spain. We're independent nations, but we still think like the colonists, like the Spaniards. We need to find new sources. What where did the thinkers of the civilizing project look towards? Well, in answer, or as a response to the chaos of the post-revolutionary, let's say, aftermath, they began to look at positivism, not the positivism of the Vienna School in Europe and Germany and later in the Anglo-Saxon world, but the positivism of France, of Comte, and later the evolutionism of Spencer, also Krausism. It was order and progress. That was the motto at the time. This was a motto that was very much adopted by Latin American thinkers, both not only in the Rio de la Plata region, also in Mexico, by people like Gabino Barreda in his famous Oración Cívica, as a kind of like celebration of order, progress, which meant in them basically urban capitalist development, industrial development, a rejection of everything that came with the colonial, quote unquote, feudal past, a rejection of Spain, an embrace or even fetishization of North American culture of the United States, what later José Enrique Rodó would call Nordomania, and he would criticize very firmly, and the idea of also a complete erasure of the legacy of mestizaje and indigeneity that existed in the continent. This is important because, as you might all know, this very old dichotomy between civilization and barbarism that you find very much present not only in the rhetorical ideological spectrum, but even in the literary, let's say, nascent social realist novel of Latin America, for example, in Rómulo Gallegos' Doña Bárbara, right? It very much informed. There is this clear dichotomy between civilization being equated to an urban capitalist model of development, whereas the countryside, the urban centers, the gaucho, el mestizo, never mind the indio, are all relegated to the status of subhuman or uncivilized, barbarism. There's a couple comments in the chat. Let me just check very quickly. Orden y Progreso, that was written in the Brazilian flag. And it was the explicit, also, as you probably know, motto that oriented the Mexican sort of slow descent to the Batista regime. Not to the Batista, to El Porfiriato. So all of these thinkers in the civilizing project, right, shared what Antonio Caso, the Mexican philosopher, would call bovarismo. Tenía un espíritu bovarista. It's a reference, of course, to Flaubert's Madame Bovary, the woman who is always trying to sort of fit into a kind of social class, who's always pretending to be something she's not, who has an inferiority complex, as Samuel Ramos would say. Latin America feels itself to be inferior to Europe, to the United States, and therefore looks toward them in a completely subservient and imitative fashion. And this is what I call the first irony. I noticed three major ironies in the story that I say, but that is that, these people are clearly claiming that they want to achieve mental independence on the one hand. On the other hand, in order to achieve mental independence, the model for independence is borrowed from the United States, from positivism, from this, from that, right? There's always, in other words, a lingering dependency that in order to find independence, the colonized must make recourse to these resources. And finally, this genealogy culminates in the so-called assumptive project of the 20th century, where Latin America now turns against the civilizing project because of its limited scope, because it turned out to be a process that certainly helped the growth of an urban bourgeoisie and middle class and capitalist, let's say, affluent aristocracy also, but left the majority of the people outside, that denied the history of mestizaje, denied its Indo-American legacy and the pre-Columbian past. And so the people from the Assumptive Project begin, Sea tells us, a project of historical recuperation. The idea of we need to assimilate our own past in order to find an authentic future. We can't just simply deny the colonial past or the Indo-American past or the Mesoamerican past. We need to appropriate it. Now, the language of appropriation is a language that, of course, is finicky or weird, right? Like, how do you appropriate the past, right? Different theoretical models, political ideologies will prove themselves to be candidates, as it were, for this process of appropriation. But this generation, first generation of the Assumptive Project, was emblemized by the thinkers of the so-called Arielista moment, José Enrique Rodó being at the helm, but also José Martí, Francisco García Calderón being another important voice. And here, the concept of mental independence really becomes extended to the concept of cultural independence. And it is here that we finally find the foundations for a truly decolonial project. I think Iri Zavala has written about this in, I think, a persuasive manner. It's the moment in which people begin to move away not only from positivism as a model for philosophy and authoritarianism and urban capitalist development, but they begin to take in modernist, revolutionary, progressive, emancipatory political tendencies that will eventually nurture or give birth to a properly decolonial and post-colonial thought, as we will see already with Mariátegui in the 1920s. And in fact, already the thinkers of the Athenaeum of the Youth had very much expressed the sentiment of trying to find a kind of alternative emancipatory future that would be aligned to revolutionary experiences. Of course, Martí himself is the greatest precursor of this movement. Pradeep asked the question, a clarification. Within this tradition, or in general, maybe, what is the difference between imperialism and colonialism? Well, imperialism is there's no general, again, this is another of those questions that is a semantic question. Depending on the theories you ask, these people define terms differently. Colonialism and imperialism are are two terms that are defined very broadly or very narrowly, depending on who you ask. The simplest answer is that imperialism would be the kind of expansionist venture that one finds in the relationship between nation states or between empires, but not in the traditional sense of like the 16th century, say the Iberian Empire. You can have imperialism without empires, right? Without the Iberian Empire, which seems counterintuitive, right? Colonization implies a much more, quote unquote, a process that does not only involve territorial sovereignty or occupation or usurpation, in other words, claiming the territory as your own, but also an incorporation of that population, either through extermination, indoctrination, to the norms of your own culture. Colonization extends to the norms of life, to the forms of life that, let's say, the colonizer nation or empire brings with it, right? Whereas imperialism can be just like, blanket up, kill everybody, take the land, and we go over there. Colonization has to do it has to do with a progressive process of conversion, transformation, instrumentalization of labor, many things that we will see Quijano already identifies. And how coloniality then is distinguished from this process is equally important. Imperialism would be better pitted against republicanism, no? Well, I don't think so. I don't think so because that would be nice if it were the case. But I think that already reveals a kind of maybe kind of like wishful thinking that that republicanism is somehow a bulwark against imperialism, but we know that's not the case. In fact, we know that in fact nation states are every bit as capable of engaging in not only colonialism in the sense of like let's say cultural expansion, satirization of cultures, but even military, blunt, good old military intervention and usurpation, right? So I don't know. Could colonization be considered a subset of imperialism? Rather than a subset, I think these are just coordinated concepts, right? Because it makes it, I don't think, because I'm not sure of the generality relationship here. I'm not prepared to say that imperialism is the genus and that colonization is just a species, because I think that would imply that all forms of colonization imply imperialism, and I'm not sure I'm ready to make that leap. Although, again, it's going to be depending on how you define the terms. There's a suitably, let's say, tidy way to make those terms match out in that way, but I wouldn't go there. There's a generic correlation between colonialism and and imperialism, though, a pretty effective one. Yes. I mean, de facto is there's undoubtedly a question. All I'm trying to point out at present is simply that the semantics of the terms is slippery. It's by no means shared, right? People mean very different things when they talk about imperialism. I mean, is it simply there's a very restricted conception that delimits it to the action of empires. And then what is an empire? Well, is the United States an empire? Well, it's a nation state, right? So it's a republic. Well, but we can speak of American or North American imperialism in a broader sense, in which the juridical status of the nation state does not exhaust its capacity to operate as an imperial nation. Therefore, we can speak of imperialism under the conditions of republicanism, right? So things get dicey the moment that semantics get split up, and the moment that we distinguish what things are called and how they work, right? I think that's a fine way to put it. Yes, even within language. A lot of settler colonialism does not have an imperial center, right? And that's a very important point, right? Even if we speak about Spanish, the colonial bias remains. Spanish is an imperial language. Yes, and that's a question that, of course, the decolonial thinkers that we're going to be talking about survey, which is the extent to which even accepting the language of the colonizer invariably reproduces in some way or other the matrix of coloniality, the epistemic dependency of Eurocentrism, or whatever colonizer culture happens to operate. But let's move forward a little bit. Here's a quote by Sea. It would be from American in America that the spirit, conscious of a larger freedom, would confront itself in order to give birth to a new humanity. It will be this struggle that gives meaning to the history of Latin America in the 20th century, a history that will transcend its natural borders as part of a larger history in which the final destiny of humanity will be judged. In the demands for freedom born in Latin America, many other peoples will find meaning of their own demands. This idea is what I mentioned to you earlier. Latin America is not only now looking for independence for itself, it wants to be itself a model for humanity. It wants to think of Latin America as a place where the humanity of the future can sort of take lead or can follow from. This is, of course, paradigmatically, let's say, emblemized in its most delirious form in Vasconcelos, but it's reiterated time and time again, including by the people of the modernity-coloniality movement, despite their own tentative proclamations about what pluriversality means. We're going to see that this concept is a little bit, well, let's put it this way, let's say, trying to have your cake and eat it. This is a graph that I mean, the font's small and I can't like move my, this is a graph just describing the evolution of the projects by Sea. Again, this is just to rehearse, but let me just move forward one more time. So Sea tells us something interesting. So here's where we finally begin the more proximate history that I want to sort of forge. Sea tells us that the assumptive project, right? And it's called assumptive because precisely there's a kind of assumption of the past or appropriation of the past, right? According to Sea, before, what Latin American thinkers did was simply juxtapose ideas coming from without. Foreign models, foreign theories, they would just like pile them up one on top of another without really understanding how it is that our own social historical reality requires unique, theoretical and practical political demands. In order to cross over from this juxtapositional mode to a dialectical mode, this is Sea himself, we needed an appropriative dialectics. We needed an appropriation of the past rather than a kind of rejection of the Iberian colonial and Indo-American past. But this process of assumption of the past passes through different phases. Sea identifies three. I won't get into what the three are, but what's important is that crucially, it passes through the period between the 1940s and the 1960s that I mentioned, in which, of course, in the wake of the Second World War and the geopolitical conflicts of Europe, the crisis of Western civilization reaches a kind of fatal denouement or a point of no return. And at that moment, also, the influx of historicist, circumstantialist philosophy begins to inform the continent, largely as a result of the influence of what I called the transterrados from Spain, who fled from Franco's fascist regime. And on the other hand, this process culminates in the 1970s, in the final moment of the Assumptive Project, well, the last one he got to write about at least, which is the liberationist movement of the 1970s. Now, thinkers after Sea have continued this genealogy and said that after the liberationist moment comes the decolonial turn. But the decolonial turn is, in fact, in so many ways, almost like a just natural extension rather than departure, a radicalization, if you will, of the liberationist moment, that I think it's impossible to understand it without this kind of like immediate lineage. Let me look once more. Yeah. So, okay, just checking the comments in the chat. So, the central thesis in the seminar for reading this, the emergence of the modernity-coloniality movement, central methodological thesis, is that there are three historical precursors that belong to the evolution of the Assumptive Project as described by Serra, which is part of this lineage of Latin American universalisms, to which it must be traced. These three moments are, first, the indigenista tradition of the 1920s, spearheaded by Mariátegui. Second, the historicist sequence of the 1940s, spearheaded by Gauss and Leopoldo Sea, mostly centered in Mexico. And the third is the liberationist moment of the 1970s, which was spearheaded, one could argue, who is like, the most important figure, but for my purposes here and for the purposes of the literature we're going to be reading, certainly Enrique Dussel, I think. And I'm going to just say a word about these three things. What is it about the indigenista precursor? So the indigenista precursor. As I mentioned, José Carlos Mariátegui's 7 essays, Los Siete Ensayos, from 1928, is a direct source of inspiration for Quijano. And of course, he cites it very explicitly in the essay, The Coloniality of Power and Social Classification. Why? What inspires really Quijano, the most important thing that Mariátegui does is lead him to think of the concept of what he will call historical structural heterogeneity. How it is that cultural forms, classes, ethnic groups are brought together into a systematic totality, which is, of course, the modern world. The modern world. The modern world, which we will see in short notice, Quijano describes in very specific ways as a matrix of power that operates through very specific institutions and through very specific concepts, or there's central axes, or let's say dimensions that are regulated by power in this complete integral totality that is modernity. But it was Mariátegui who first realized this. He understood how it is that the development of capitalism, in the case of the Andes in particular, and Peru even more particularly, implied a process of social hierarchization, a division of society in not only classes, but classes that were racially coded and determined, that were vertically distributed, and that this was essential to understand not only how it is that society, like, let's say, engaged in patterns of discrimination, normative valuations about who's better, who's worse, who's ugly, who's not, but furthermore determined very clearly labor laws and how the outsourcing of wealth and labor occurred from the rural peripheries to the urban centers. And I'm already using a terminology that will become clearer in a bit. What's interesting, of course, about Mariátegui is that he understood something that was peculiar to the Andes, which was that the urban capitalist centers of production, the capitals, depended on outsourced goods and labor coming from the rural latifundios, the landlord oligarchies, that operated in a semi-feudal manner, essentially as serfs, right? The gamonales, the landlords in these rural plantations, the hacienda system, the good old hacienda system, right? Essentially outsource labor from the rural centers into the capitals, and then from then on into the foreign markets. There was this, but what this means is that short of being a kind of integrated, quote unquote, capitalist, wage salaried, modern industrialized world from which a, let's say, industrial proletariat would rise, Mariátegui said, no, that Peru is a completely different story because we have a semi-feudal, medieval, right, mode of production and world instantiated in the rural areas, and we have a quasi-dysfunctional capitalist central capital state, and these work symbiotically. It's not that there are two states or something like that. No, this is part of a system. This all works together. And you have to understand how it works together as part of capitalism. It was this little model that Mariátegui understood that then Quijano, through the inspiration and resources of Immanuel Wallerstein's world systems theory, which is also very influential for the liberation philosophy, is going to be bloated into the dependency theory framework of the relationship between nations and regions of the world, peripheries and centers. So the relation between the rural and the capital urban centers within Peru, say, mirrors the relationship between Latin American nations or Latin America and the European centers, the colonized and the colonizer. There's a kind of metonymic, structural, symbiotic, let's say, relationship here, or isomorphy, if you will. There's a couple comments in the chat. Let me see. Is absolute transculturation reached through processes of relative transculturation structurally parallel with Hegel's absolute knowledge reached through the process of dialectics? The first part, yes. The second part, whether it's reached through a dialectical process a la Hegelian, right, resolution, that's going to depend on the thinkers. Certain thinkers, like, for example, Kuhlen, like, for example, Sayah himself, believe in something like a dialectical process. Others, like Mariátegui, follow Marx. But not everybody adopts a dialectical model. For example, Dussel, the thinkers of the philosophy of liberation, are going to be much more cautious, some of them at least, with regards to the appropriation of dialectics. And they're going to be critical of dialectics in the name of something they will call analectics or some other form of, quote unquote, historical, let's say, revolutionary program. So yes, but not necessarily in a dialectical manner, right? And here's the central quote from Quijano. This is from the essay we read towards the end. Let me move this so we can read it. In 1928, José Carlos Mariátegui was without a doubt the first to begin to see, not just in Latin America, that in his space-time, the social relations of power, whatever their previous character, existed and acted simultaneously and together in a single whole structure of power. This is very important because the appeal, we're gonna return to this later. This whole appeal to there being a kind of totality or a structure of power that encompasses modernity, right, is something that he is going to present as a kind of rejoinder to what he perceives is the dominant postmodern trend of, let's say, Western philosophy at the time, continental theory, whatever you want, which in his opinion is dispersionary, atomizing, chastises the concept of totality, and therefore, this is a, like, let's say, necessary concept that needs to be rehabilitated. Where are we? Here we go. Oh, he perceived that there could not be a homogeneous unity with the continuous relations among its elements, moving itself in a continuous and systematic history. Therefore, the idea of a socialist revolution by historical necessity had to be directed against the whole of that power. Far from consisting of a new bureaucratic reconcentration of power, it could have meaning only as a redistribution among the people in their daily lives of the control over their conditions of social existence. And just to clarify one point here, when he's talking about, the idea that the structure of power, that is this totality, right, which is the modernity, as he will say, the idea that it cannot be reduced to a homogeneous unity, but it has to be conceived as the kind of like amalgamation within a totality of heterogeneous elements that do not cease to be heterogeneous for that reason, is exactly what I was mentioning a moment ago when I was describing that Mariátegui, in the 7 essays, describes Peruvian society as this kind of fractured totality between two modes of production, a semi-feudal latifundio in the rural areas and a capitalist center, right? So that kind of like composability between disparate modes of production, which is also racially coded, right? The indigenous working force, the gamonales, and then the capitalist like workers with these wage laborers in the factories and the centers. That is a highly heterogeneous structure. It's not homogenized, right? But it is a totality regardless. It's a system. It works, right? As a kind of integral thing. Okay. The second precursor is the historicist precursor, to which I alluded before, and to which Leopoldo Sea himself belongs. As a result of Franco's regime, which led, as you probably know, to the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War in the late 30s, a group of intellectuals were forced into exile to Latin America in different places, but largely in Mexico, also in Argentina and other parts. But this generation of intellectuals, which has been named the Transterrados, brought with them to the continent the influence of new philosophical trends that had been transpiring not only in Spain, but in Europe more broadly, specifically the thinking of Ortega y Gasset, the so-called circumstantialist philosophy of Ortega y Gasset, and also, as Ortega y Gasset himself was very much influenced by these other collateral trends, new trends that were transpiring in European philosophy that were, and this is the crucial part, philosophies that were being appropriated by Europeans themselves to lever and leverage a critique of European modernity and even Western civilization as a whole. This, of course, can be traced back all the way to Nietzsche, who traces, the derelictions of Western civilization to the Greeks. But of course, in the 20th century, in the long history of 20th century German philosophy and historicist philosophy, the name of Heidegger reeks strong. But also before Dilthey and later Sartrean existentialism, all these trends come into the continent. And what's interesting here is something that will be reiterated later in the critique of colonialism by the modernity-coloniality movement, which is, Dussel says this with absolute precision. These thinkers, Heidegger, later, Sartre, Levinas, Derrida, you name it, all these guys engage in an internal critique of Europe, an internal critique of European philosophy, its philosophical foundations, its mode of civilization, modernity, you name it, right? And what Latin Americans are doing now, and not only Latin Americans, but different parts of the globe in their own way, right? Like the subaltern studies, like trend in the East, right? Okay, what all of these vectors are doing is engaging in their own critiques of Europe. That is not just an internal critique. This is going to be important because it's going to lead to also the concept of internal colonialism versus external colonialism, elaborated by Casanovas in the 40s, that we're going to talk about actually later, in the 60s, sorry, not in the 40s. But all these trends, phenomenology and hermeneutics, historicism, circumstantialism, all of these will be weaponized and incorporated in Latin America in order for Latin America to set for itself a new hermeneutic paradigm and task, and a new task for intellectuals and philosophy in particular. The most important of these tutelary voices that came from abroad was doubtlessly José Gálvez. He was an incredible influence in a generation of intellectuals, including Leopoldo Sea, who, Gauss was his teacher, his master, his tutor, but also people like Arturo Arrau, Arturo Roig, Arturo Andrés Roig. Many of these names who are associated now with the so-called historicist moment of Latin American thought, which is this moment that begins in the 40s as a result of the arrival of the Transterrados, nevertheless will later shuttle and transition into the liberationist moment. Much like many of the thinkers of the liberationist moment will then incorporate themselves to the decolonial turn, like Dussel, for example. This moment was very much important also, besides these trends coming from philosophy in particular, historicism being a big deal, right? Also by the influx of the so-called history of ideas by Arthur Lovejoy. The history of ideas, as you might know or probably know, was a paradigm in historiography, which essentially said that ideas have a history, that the history of ideas enabled us to trace also the axiological belief systems of a civilization, and that this was an important part of historiographical research. What Latin Americans did was very much in the spirit of what I have already mentioned, the assumptive project of recuperation of the past, is to say that the first thing that philosophers needed to do was a history of ideas of Latin America. Now, you might be saying, what could that possibly mean? If Latin Americans have been, since the colonial period, doing nothing but imitating, either because they're directly colonized and enforced into a particular doctrine, right? Scholastic philosophy, later positivism, you name it, right? Whatever. They don't have ideas of their own, right? So what can you look at? That it's everything is a copy or a bad copy of a European or a North American, whatever. Leopoldo Sea's answer is extremely ingenious here. He says that actually, yes, that's right. There hasn't been truly a philosophy that deserves to be called Latin American, but like Gauss himself already said before him, there have been thinkers. Yes, there hasn't been a systematic philosophy a la Kant or Hegel, whatever, but there have been great essays and there have been moments where thinkers have appropriated badly, misappropriated philosophical ideas from without, from Europe, from the United States, you name it. And in this misappropriation or disfiguration, in the attempt to apply these ideas and adapt them to their own social realities, an originality emerged. And it is necessary to understand the history of these displacements and misplacements. What Schwartz will name, ideas fuera de lugar, misplaced ideas. There's a couple comments in the chat. Let me just very quickly. There's okay. Douglas, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you for this really exciting seminar. I had a question that kind of goes back to your overall thesis about how absolute transculturation, in which foundations of a humanist cosmopolitan society are forged as an alternative to European modernity. I wanted to connect that to, so I'm curious about the meaning of humanism there, and especially because during this historicist precursor bit, you're talking about this European philosophical tradition, thinkers like Derrida, Althusser, Foucault, who are very much anti-humanist tradition.
Absolutely.
And so, like, this sort of paradox of like a kind of humanism after coloniality or after colonialism, but also a kind of, the other paradox of a universality or universalism amid other universalisms, an alternative universalism, just like the philosophical inconsistency of that very setup. And does it have a kind of resonance or a mirror with the kind of humanism after anti-humanism?
So I think yes. So that very perceptive, right? Like, so for those of you who are not familiar with some of the authors that I mentioned, so Heidegger, in particular, Heidegger and thinkers after Heidegger, Derrida, Althusser, although the influence of Althusser really comes a little bit later into this constellation. So we're not there yet. But already with Heidegger, you have a very explicit sort of resistance to humanism. And many of the registers and thinkers, I mean, Marx included, right? Like humanism is not exactly a term that you necessarily associate with Marx. So at least some people like to say no, right? But Latin American thinkers always weaponize and, this is one of those displacements that I was just mentioning. Humanism was always at the center. Humanism was something like an invariant that until at least the 70s did not begin to be problematized. And even then, I would argue, was still at the very core. Why is that? I think it's largely because there was a much more, and this is something that that Sea actually speaks about very strongly, and Gauss too. The reason why there hasn't been philosophy proper, but there have been thinkers, right, is because these thinkers are always thinking about what can philosophy do for us Latin Americans because of our practical urgency. Latin American is in a state of perpetual crisis. Gauss says history moves in this kind of movement, diastolic and systolic. I forget which one it is, but like the moment that you breathe in and the moment you breathe out, right? Like the moment you breathe in is the moment of systematic reification, the moment of construction systems. That's what he thinks is philosophy, right? A moment in which our civilization or a culture has achieved a morsel of organization or order, you know, institutional, let's say, homogeneity or stability, even if momentary. And this allows things to become built. Latin America is not like that, Gauss says. Latin America has been, since the wars of independence, in a state of permanent crisis. It has only allowed for this kind of like perpetual renovation, this necessity to like sort of bring you stuff here. Obviously, institutionally, we don't have to talk about like the precarity of our nation states and republics, the propensity towards caudillismo and authoritarianism. And because of that, the way that philosophy was appropriated was always instrumentally catered towards a kind of social political program. Latin Americanists were therefore called oftentimes by those who believe that philosophy should go a la europea, like Europe does, right? The politicians, they said. So I think this demand for humanism, or the reason why humanism prevails in this context, is largely because of political motivations, right? Because of this circumstance that I described. Now, the other thing that you mentioned is like the plurality of universalisms that present themselves against one another. Is there a kind of methodological incoherence? I think part of what happens, and this is something that I get to in the book, is that one of the things that is necessary in order to achieve universalism, according to these thinkers, is to, of course, rid yourself of the residual particularism that presents itself as a universalism. In other words, Eurocentrism. Eurocentrism presents itself as universal, but it's not. It's a particular culture that's elevated or reified to the status of universal. And we're going to get into that because Dussel and Mignolo next week identify the ways in which this is part of the myth of modernity. But the problem is that every time, every step along the way, what Latin American thinkers will say is, aha, we haven't cleansed ourselves enough of Eurocentrism or particularism. So we haven't yet achieved the proper universal scope. It's still necessary to go further. In a moment or in a movement that, notice, mirrors the European continental philosophical arc of critique after Heidegger, according to which the critique of metaphysics needs to be radicalized more and more because, you know, you were still too metaphysical, to this, to that. So there's a kind of parallel movement that occurs in Latin America in the search for a kind of non-Eurocentric horizon to that European philosophy follows in the attempts to purge its own metaphysical, let's say, latent past. And I think that's what I called, that's the third irony that I called, that even in its mode of self-criticism, Latin America is not only dependent on the sources of European authors and so on, but even the mode of self-criticism that history, right? There's a couple more coloniality being with this combo. Well, as you know, Sylvia Winter comes into the fore, and she's in the next slide. So we're going to, Schwarz too will criticize this idea. Yeah, I mean, both Schwarz and incidentally, if people want to see what today people are doing, or how they take this idea of misplaced ideas and how it is that this whole narrative and dialectics of appropriation that was made popular by Sea, but using also Schwarz's concept is elaborated. I'll write it in the chat so everybody can see it. I really recommend this book by Elias Palti, which is called idea fuera de lugar, but it's translated recently as misplaced ideas. Palti is a phenomenal historian slash philosopher. And I think this book is a kind of spiritual sequel to Santiago Castro Gomez's Critique of Latin American Reason, which is another classic. But anyway, let's move forward so we don't fall back. So in this context, the historicist moment, these influences come along. Here is where I think Latin America achieves a measure, a kind of methodological self-consciousness. It's a kind of Kantian moment, if you will. It's the Latin American critical turn, because it is the moment also in which Latin America enters this phase that I mentioned to you earlier of the debate, explicit debate, about who are we Latin Americans and what does it take to do authentic philosophy in the continent? Why haven't we been able to do so? Have we been able to do so? And here two camps appeared. There was the camp of the so-called universalists who claimed that what was needed was the normalization of philosophy as an academic professional discipline within the academy in this process of generational transmission that I alluded to earlier. And then on the other hand, came those, and that meant, training in the canon of Western philosophy, of European philosophy from the Greeks until, God knows who, Heidegger, right, whatever. And then it was another camp represented precisely by people like Gauss, by Sea, who were the Latin Americanists, also Ardao, who were also the historicists, the people influenced by Ortega y Gasset and all. And what those people said, following Ortega y Gasset, was that philosophy has to begin through and with a meditation of its own distinctive circumstances. That philosophy has first and foremost a responsibility to its own immediate circumstances. And only through a meditation of its own circumstances can an original philosophy ever hope to emerge from American soil. Now, this might seem like the very classical old division between universalists and relativists, right? The historicists are saying that all philosophy is relative to its time and place, and that, nobody can actually make universal pronouncements. The universalists are saying, no, philosophy is stateless. It's not dependent. The questions of philosophy have nothing to do with your own particularity. They're universal. They're human. But it's not as simple as that, because the Latin Americanists, as I've already mentioned, right, always had this idea that it's not only Latin America that is in search for an independence or a description of itself. In this search for itself, theoretical, that opens the way to a future, a utopian, cosmopolitan future, it becomes also a template and model for humanity. So what the Latin Americanists will say, including Sea, is that actually this quote-unquote circumstantial attunement to the local is a necessary preparatory propedeutic to achieving and entering the realm of universal philosophy proper. So what you have in Sea is a distinctive breakdown of an order, methodological order, through which philosophy reaches this point. You begin with a history of ideas. This is what Gauss said was needed first and foremost. Tracing back how it is that European ideas were appropriated, misappropriated for different purposes in Latin America, juxtaposed, blah, blah, blah. In a second stage, you have already a philosophy of history. A philosophy of history is, once you have the history of ideas, you can trace this kinds of invariant patterns or the logic that history moves. This is what Sea himself tries to do in his own dialectic of the projects when he notices that the history of the evolution of Latin American history and its appropriation of ideas has been characterized, for example, by a juxtapositional rather than dialectical mode of appropriation. And then the third stage, after this historical recollection, the philosophy of history, comes the ontology of man. This is what he calls it. Now, of course, anybody who is steeped in Heidegger, and as Douglas just reminded us, right, this for Heidegger would seem an oxymoronic locution, because, it's to confuse the ontic and the ontological. Man is not Dasein exactly, the human is not Dasein. let's leave that aside. One of the big questions, in fact, that occurs in this sequence, it's very much expressed in the Hyperion group, which was influenced by Sea and very much by Sartre, specifically Emilio Uranga's work, which is magnificent, and Luis Villoro, is this kind of idea of an ontology of the Latin American subject, which seems, again, like a short circuit between the ontic and the ontological. How could you do an ontology of an Mexican being, right, or something like that, which is what Uranga proposed? He has a really clever answer to that question, but I'm not going to get into that because that takes us far afield. So a few more comments in the chat. Colonized people of the world unite. Colonized, yeah. Okay. So that's the historicist precursor, and the final precursor is the liberationist precursor. So by the end of the 1960s, there had been this feeling of exhaustion, that the sort of intellectual currents that had come from Europe and that, intellectuals were trafficking in, Heidegger, existentialism, historicism, basically reproduce a kind of elitist sequestering of philosophy in the academy that prevented its connection to political urgent issues, despite their overt claims to the contrary, right? Latin Americanists were saying, no, we need to be careful about our own circumstances. But nevertheless, these approaches remained too, they would say, idealist, too much centered on ideas, right? The history of ideas by Arthur Lovejoy becomes an exhausted paradigm by this point. And this is the moment in which thinkers, not just philosophers, but intellectuals, begin to look for other avenues and sources, mostly coming from the social sciences this time, to have a more quote-unquote materialist, engaged, let's say, interpretation of social reality that would also be conducive to a political emancipatory practice. This was a moment in which the intellectual current that would emerge and the most important trajectory would come from, again, El Rio de la Plata, as a response to the experiences of Peronismo. And many of the thinkers involved in this sequence had an ambiguous relationship to Peronismo, some much closer to it, some further away from it. But essentially what occurs here is the most important single, I think, development is the evolution and appropriation of dependency theory from economics and sociology into a more general program of thinking, a liberationist program. Dependency theory is, I'll say a word about that later, but dependency theory is something that has shaped and determines the evolution of liberationist thought from the beginning of the 1970s, and also leaks into or transitions into the interpretation of the modernity-coloniality movement. Dependency theory is a reconceptualization of the relationship that modernity establishes between centers and peripheries. It also enjoins, and this is also something that will be bolstered by Wallerstein's world systems theory, a reconceptualization of what modernity means as an internal European phenomenon or as a vicarious phenomenon that needs, in fact, the labor and outsourcing of peripheries. The other thing that's really important is that in this moment, there is a revalorization of popular wisdom. The intellectualist, elitist, historicist moment had sort of divorced itself from the people. And so there's a kind of populist vector in the liberationist turn, very much visible, for example, in the work of Paulo Freire, the pedagogy of liberation, but also in the theology of liberation of Gutierrez, and in the philosophy of liberation with people like Kuhlen and Dussel, of the idea that the people, common people, non-intellectuals, non-philosophers, are organic intellectuals, that in their everyday life and discourse, they incarnate a kind of spontaneous wisdom or knowledge that, even though it's not institutionalized, even though it's not marshaled or theoretically mediated by these concepts of philosophy or high theory, right? Nevertheless, that's where the true originality of Latin America must be thought. And after all, those are the people that philosophy needs to answer to. And this creates a very, very strange I would say sometimes you can say parasitic relationship between the intellectual and the people. Because of course it's very, very easy, as you can say, to say, well, the people are organic intellectuals. They speak an original, truly philosophically changing language, right? But they don't make it explicit in theory. Who makes it explicit? Well, me, the philosopher. And so in order to transcribe this popular wisdom to make it explicit, right, I ventriloquize this discourse through my own conceptual repertoire and ideas. And this is one of the big critiques of the philosophy of liberation, that in appealing to this kind of like, quote unquote, pre-ontological spontaneous wisdom of the people, nevertheless, what they ended up doing was ventriloquizing popular discourse through a series of surrogate philosophical theories that they retroactively projected onto the people, right? So the idea of the organic intellectual, which became very popular in this populist moment, has become extremely suspicious ever since. But that aside, nevertheless, the most important, I think, idea that will sort of dovetail into the modernity-coloniality movement from this moment is that, and this is a radicalization of the indigenista moment, that the struggle of Latin Americanist philosophy should align itself not only with, say, the Indo-American and mestizo populations that had been delegated to the status of barbarism in the 19th century, right? But furthermore, that the struggles of indigenous people and mestizos also coalesced with the struggles of the poor laborers, of former slaves and blacks, of women. All forms of minoritarian struggle came together or come of a piece in this kind of joint kind of liberationist movement. And furthermore, something that, of course, is very famously voiced by both Gutierrez and Freire, is that the movement of emancipation is a movement that is not only for the colonized or the oppressed, but also for the oppressor. That whatever emancipation looks like, at the end of the day, it implies a liberation for both. It's not just simply that the oppressed takes the role of the oppressor or becomes a new master. It's that the very matrix that sustains the vertical relationship of asymmetry explodes onto itself. So there's an integration of all marginalized minoritarian struggles. There's a reconfiguration of the hermeneutic framework away from historiography of the history of ideas to a sociological economic analysis provided by dependency theory. And there's also an influx of new philosophical ideas coming from the post-Heideggerian tradition, largely the work of Levinas and the ethical focus that Levinas brings in his attempts to derogate and radicalize Heideggerian ontology, or the ontological primacy of philosophy. Here's a quote by Enrique Dussel that traces already in 1982, before the explicit treatment of decoloniality in relation to Fanon, to Césaire, and the thinkers of the Caribbean by, for example, Mignolo and others. Already in the 70s and in the 80s, you see Dussel and even Sea make references to Fanon and to this kind of more unified, comprehensive struggle. Frantz Fanon would say that in the first place, colonized intellectuals assimilate the culture of imperialist occupiers. In a second phase, they recoil from what they have done and resolve to return to the people. Finally, in a third period, after having tried to lose themselves within the people, to identify with the people, they come to understand that they must shake the people. Instead of favoring the people's lethargy, they become the ones who awaken the people. Nevertheless, the critical action of the organic intellectual is not sufficient, as Gramsci would say. So these notions of the organic intellectual as an insufficient force, but nevertheless as a prevalent motor of history, this kind of dialectics of escalation that leads to the upsurge of the marginalized and oppressed, all of this is going to be incorporated into the philosophy of liberation, and it's going to continue in the decolonial turn. So comment in the chat, let me just see. Quoting a question I had, I go, apologies if I missed, did you mention that you will get your framing of pluriverse If not, yes, no, the pluriversality concept will be it will become, we will discuss that next week when we talk about Mignolo in particular. Okay? Mignolo, Walsh, and Grosfold. And in this regard, Dussel, already here in the 70s, and this is from a later text, The Invention of the Americas, one of his most famous texts, is going to say that the framing of the projects, the dialectic of projects elaborated by Leopoldo Sea, is tentative and must be radicalized, because the liberationist project is not just simply about appropriating the past and that through an appropriation of the past you reach the future. No, there is a kind of struggle that cannot be limited to historical appropriation. That's, I think Dussel is correct in this point, that the myth of the historicists that the liberationists really broke with, and this will carry over into the decolonial turn, is this idea that, very Heideggerian. If only we go back far enough and understand the ideas and, the sedimented prejudices of our metaphysics and the West and the Greeks and everything in between, we will become freed for a second beginning or something like that, right? We can cross over a kere. But no, according to Dussel, this is not possible. Any merely assumptive liberating project will favor the criollos, behave conservatively on behalf of large landholders, and uphold a liberalism that denies the indigenous, Afro-Latin American, and colonial past. Authentically liberating projects must strive to lead modernity beyond itself to transmodernity. And this is the concept that I want to zero in that. Such concepts, such projects require an amplified rationality, which makes room for the reason of the other within a community of communication among equal participants, as envisaged by Bartolomé de las Casas in the 1550 the famous debate which concerned the status of the Indios as men, and therefore the rights of the Indio in the colonies as colonized. Let's comment in the chat. Let me stop here for 1 second before we move forward. How are we doing, everybody? Good? All right. Let's take a short break. Okay, so bathroom break, a 10-minute break, and then we can come back. I will talk about world systems theory and the Dussel essay Beyond Eurocentrism, which I think provides the template for the critique of Eurocentrism and the revisionary concept of modernity that he proposes in tandem with dependency theory and Wallerstein's world systems approach. So that's it. See you in time. So it's 12:46. Let's come back at 12:56. Make sure you... Okay. Okay, cool. So let's resume. Hopefully, everyone's there. Only a few faces. Next time, please, the more people that can have their cameras on, the merrier. I understand if today people don't have cameras on, but it's always nice to feel like you're talking to people, not to the void. Okay, so let's continue. So what I want to do now is just delve a little bit further into the first of the two readings that are at the center of today's class, and that's the Dussel reading Beyond Eurocentrism, which I think is extremely important because it's a good summary, a great summary, in fact, of the import that the world systems approach that was developed by Wallerstein in collaboration also with Quijano, leads to a reconceptualization, a revisionary, if you will, concept of modernity that reconstructs our own historiographical recollection of the colonial process and colonization. And it is this reconceptualization of modernity that is going to be appropriated and carried over into the decolonial, into the modernity-coloniality movement as a lever of a critique for Eurocentrism. Okay? So without further ado, let me just give me a second here. All right, cool. Can everybody see the slide? Okay, great. So the first thing to say is that the question, the way that the world systems theoretical approach sort of acquires a kind of much bigger audience, it first really is a distinctively sociological, historical debate among intellectuals and academics. But as we approach the end of the century, already in the 80s and the 90s especially, there's this huge debate about globalization, right? Globalization becomes like everyone's like cup of tea and the new talk of globalization. This, of course, has largely to do with the perceived inevitable expansion of liberal capitalism around the globe and the collapse of the Soviet Union eventually. So it is in this context that these debates become much wider in scope. But what I want to just do is, in order to explain how it is that this debates about globalization require a kind of reconceptualization of world systems, according to, in Wallerstein's sense, is to trace back this question to how it is that the liberation philosophy incorporated these concepts in order to forge a reconstituted concept of modernity. And as we've seen, like as I've already indicated, right, the concept of basically of modernity in at work in these traditions is going to be used to designate not only a historical process that occurs in a region, but a matrix of power that's tied to an ideology, to a worldview, a cosmology, an epistemology. And it is that part that we will be progressively zoning into, the way in which presumably modernity carries with itself these ideological, even mythical, we will see Dussel says, components, right? And so that the power structure or the matrix of power that is instituted through modernity includes in itself a kind of inextricable epistemological or epistemic mythical component, which is Eurocentrism. Okay. So let me just say a few things. The core, as you know, of Dussel's essay Beyond Eurocentrism, it's an idea that he revisits and elaborates in many different places, but concerns fundamentally a distinction between two concepts of modernity. One, which is the traditional concept that we have acquired, I presume most of us since primary school, even today in most universities, I presume this is the concept that we are taught. Modernity is the third sort of moment in world history that succeeds antiquity and after the Middle Ages. Middle Ages are what? That which exists precisely between antiquity and modernity. This conception is what Dussel calls the Eurocentric conception of modernity. It is a Eurocentric conception because it claims that modernity begins in Northwestern Europe and that it is inherently and intrinsically European phenomenon that is marked by a series of events that everybody sort of like knows as benchmarks: the Protestant Reform, Germanic, the French Revolution, the Enlightenment. Obviously, also you could add to this things like the Copernican revolution, right, and the posterior revolutions in physics that occur with Newton and Galileo. But this conception, essentially, long story short, claims that Europe was, as it were, the cradle of modernity, that it was a moment of flourishing, a kind of extension of the Renaissance, and a kind of new birth of a kind of flourishing of a new worldview, bolstered by the new science, the new rationalist philosophy, an intra-European phenomenon, marked also by the growth of ideas of sovereignty, freedom against quote-unquote dogma and authoritarianism, a kind of new republicanist, liberal conception of humanity. According to Dussel, following Wallerstein, this is an ideological construction. It's an ideological construction at least at two levels. First, because the tripartite distinction of history in terms of antiquity, the Middle Ages, and modernity is not only a gross simplification that completely elides, for instance, the prominence of the Islamic world during what is called the Middle Ages, but furthermore, it is a genealogy in which the cultures and civilizations of Indo-America, Mesoamerica have no place. They're not even classified in the antiquity. Of course, in your more contemporary updated books, you will find it, but traditionally not, right? And certainly America, if it has a place in history, if you look at Hegel, for example, right? It's the place of the future, right? Hegel will say. But what is the future that is assigned to the Americas, according to Hegel? It is, well, you know, the future will be to recapitulate and to realize the modernity that was already realized in Europe, right? So history moves from east to west, and this movement from east to west coincides with a vector of enlightenment or freedom, and freedom is associated with the kind of bourgeois kind of European lifestyle and subsistence that is associated with post-Enlightenment Europe. In contrast to this concept, Dussel proposes what he calls a planetary conception of modernity, and planetary here is a cheeky or indirect reference to world systemics approach, which Wallerstein again draws and develops by trying to extend into historiography in general the principal tenets that sociologists and economists had developed in dependency theory. And this was done largely also, as we will see, in collaboration with Quijano in many ways. And the central tenets of this rereading of modernity is that, in fact, modernity does not begin with these events that we normally associate. It begins earlier. And it does not begin in Northern and Western Europe, France, Germany, Britain, or in the Flanders, but actually it begins in Spain. That the first modernity occurs in the venture of the Spanish Empire across the Atlantic and the arrival of the Europeans in the Caribbean in 1492. This is the founding event of modernity. Why? Because it institutes for the first time, after the so-called third stage interregional system, which had Baghdad as its center in China, a new commercial center in which progressively Europe becomes positioned as the center precisely, through which Spain consolidates by having colonial territories all around the globe, and in which the Atlantic becomes now the center of trade. This consolidation of a first world system is also, of course, the moment of the 16th century that begins the process of colonization and the slave trade in diaspora, and is also the moment in which, for the first time, the Mediterranean, which had been peripheral until that time, becomes the center of power, before Northern Western Europe becomes the center later on. So modernity begins with Spain, 1492, and Dussel's essay, in a large manner, is a protracted, condensed defense of this thesis, or a rehearsal of this thesis. So the beginning of modernity in 1492, the first modernity, as he calls it, the Mediterranean Spanish Empire, is a modernity that begins what he calls the fourth stage of the interregional system, the first world system. And it begins with Spain. And he asks the question, why was it Spain that inaugurated this modernity? Why not China? Why not Portugal? Why China? Why not China? Because it had no interest in expanding towards Europe. It was centered in India and Central Asia. Why not Portugal? For the same reason. It looked toward India, moving south. Why Spain? It could not go east, and it had to go through the west, crossing the Atlantic, trying to find a route of maritime trade. This is the essential quote. I think this quote summarizes the historical, let's say, fundamentals. Why does Spain begin the world system, and with it, modernity? Planetary modernity, right? For the same reason that it was prevented in China and Portugal. Because Spain could not reach the center of the third stage interregional system that was Central Asia or India. Could not go east, since the Portuguese had already anticipated and had exclusivity rights. through the South Atlantic, around the coast of Western Africa, until the Cape of Buena Esperanza was discovered in 1487. Spain had only one opportunity left to go toward the center, to India, through the Occident, through the West, by crossing the Atlantic Ocean. Because of this, Spain finds without looking Amerindia. And with it, the entire European medieval paradigm enters into crisis, which is the paradigm of a peripheral culture, the farthest western point of the third stage of the interregional system, and thus inaugurates slowly but irreversibly the first world hegemony, the first world system. This is the only world system that has existed in planetary history, and this is the modern system. European in its center, capitalist in its economy. And he asks, with regards to the quote-unquote philosophical, conceptual implications, there's quite a bit in the essay about this, it's very dense, but he distinguishes between the two modernities that we now can distinguish. So not the two senses of modernity, the Eurocentric and the planetary, but once you understand modernity in a planetary scope, right, through world systems theoretic approach, you distinguish the first moment in which Spain and Portugal, the Iberian Empire in the Mediterranean, was the center and consolidated itself as the center of trade, and later, since the late 17th and 18th centuries, a progressive displacement of the center of power to Northern and Western Europe, Flanders, Britain, Germany, and France. And he says that there is actually an important distinction, not only in the geographical and the economic, let's say, power dynamics, but also in the way that each of these modernities conceptualize the central predicament for their own colonizers. Because the first philosophical modernity, the 1492 Iberian modernity, right, asked the question, had to ask the question, what rights have the Europeans to occupy, dominate, and manage the recently discovered cultures conquered by the military and in the way of being colonized? This is the debate. This philosophical predicament is concentrated at the height of late scholasticism in the Valladolid debate between Bartolomé de las Casas, Valladolid debate between Bartolomé de las Casas and Jean de Sepúlveda, in which, as I mentioned, completely steeped in the Thomist reinterpretation of Aristotle in the Christian world, the question revolves around whether the Indians are men, and therefore are they liable to be enslaved, simply barbarically abused, exterminated, and so on. Bartolomé defending the cause of the Indians, of course, right? And obviously Jean de Sepúlveda trying to justify basically their not only coerced labor, but their possible extermination. It's a beautiful debate. Those of you who have not read it, I really recommend it. It's surprisingly rigorous, and it's extraordinary because it was conducive in a moment where the campaigning for the rights of the indigenous populations by Bartolomé de las Casas, eventually, although not exclusively, we can't say, I mean, the role is like de Vitoria, led to Charles V passing the new laws of the Indies, right, which tried to not abolish exactly, but to try to put legal limits on the abuses enforced by the encomienda system, which led to the slow shift to the repartimiento system, which was basically the Castilian crown trying to have more control over the basically organization of labor in the colonies by enforcing a kind of rotational labor scheme that prevented simply the privatized ownership of coerced labor. Anyway, we don't have to get into that. This devolves into the hacienda system later. Douglas.
Yeah, quick question. This is all fascinating. I was curious to know if Dussel gets the concept of planetary from world systems theory.
He does.
And alongside that, it seems like the planetary there, or planetary modernity, is unequivocally a pejorative concept. Like it's this kind of I don't know, diagnostic of what capitalism and coloniality sort of had become. But
Hmm.
I'm thinking of other theorists like Gayatri Spivak, for example,
Hmm.
who poses the planetary against globalization. Is that sort
Hmm.
of, I mean, I know that for her, there's a much more nuanced and complex genealogy that she's trying to create there. But um, does the planetary sort of in this register kind of it does it is world systems theory kind of like for the most part like an origin point for the way it becomes later rearticulated, and there seems to be some attempt to say like there's something to be salvaged or recuperated about the idea of the planetary, or maybe it also goes to like environmental movements and so forth.
Yes, yes. So excellent question. And you're right that certainly the sense in which planetary is being used here is like different than the way that say Gayatri Spivak speaks about this, right? But and I would not say though that it is necessarily a pejorative sense, even though the concept what the concept tries to sort of like reveal for us is simply the fact that it is not an intra-European phenomenon that is modernity, but it's one that is based around the establishment of the first world system in the sense in which Spain was the first empire that held territories literally in every region of the globe. And ever since, this is this institution of a world system, which also begins a kind of like quote unquote global network of mercantile exchange, is the basis and foundations of the capitalist system. Before quote unquote the development of industrial technology and wage labor, industrialized wage labor fully takes off, right? So that the foundations of not only modernity, but capitalism, to the extent that modernity and capitalism evolve in tandem or inextricably, have to be linked to the colonization of the Americas and the exportation of slave labor from Africa, in particular for coerced labor, right? So it is definitely not a good thing, right? I mean, in the sense that it was a tragic, horrific, you know, destructive enterprise. But the concept planetary itself is not in itself a pejorative concept. It's simply a description, right? At least I think that he wouldn't want any kind of normative attachments of that kind. Let me check the chat real quick. Would John Jones do you fight in the UC? Would it be a fair reading to say that the spirit of the project with Dussel is simply to rhetorically relocate modernity center from various European metropoles to Amerindian metropoles? I I don't think so. I don't think that's the
There's a follow up.
oh, there's a follow-up. Sorry. Census has not really search trends modernity. It's one of the most robust concepts. Like C by Dussel kind of deals with your assessment. I'm just wondering at this notion that modernity starts with Spain's adventures westward, what that fundamentally tries to imply. So what it tries to imply is again at the descriptive level that modernity and capitalism begin with Spain with the consolidation of the colonial like sort of control over first the Caribbean and then the expansion throughout the Americas and the conquest of the Meso and Indo-American empires. Prescriptively, Asensa was saying this comes Dussel is promoting, and we're going to get to this in a second, a concept of transmodernity. And transmodernity is one of those concepts that is going to also be appropriated by certain vectors of the decolonial movement. Santiago Castro Gomez, who we will be reading for the third week, is one of the proponents of transmodernity. Mignolo and Walsh and Grossvogel sort of play around with the concept, but they are much more hostile to modernity in any form. So we will see how the normative prescriptive aspect sort of configures itself, right? Is that clear, Joan?
So I mean, I quite like so Mignolo places things with the two treaties, right? Like with Saragossa and what was the other one? with the two treaties which defines the boundaries, and like they position that when
Uh,
the world was like divided between Spain and Portugal.
Spain, Portugal. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Or you can go like a little further back and
Treaty of Tordesillas or Torcedillas, I think is.
Odysseus, and then
Yeah.
yeah. And you can go further back to say maybe like it's that moment, like that impetus when Spain had to find the route around to come to the Indies. That's basically, let's say, Mehmed's conquest of the
Yeah.
sand. But this idea of like putting it that it was the journey westward, like that
Mhm.
was the moment. So that's, I mean, I don't like it's specifically with Dussel where I'm having this suspicion, right? It's not with Mignolo. But
Okay. Yeah.
like or
But
like specifically this particular framing where I'm wondering whether yeah, like it's as we spoke earlier, I mean you spoke earlier about the sense of inferiority, trying to transpose ideas. With the ghosts of these, what do you say, the sort of drives, like it need not have ended in the 1970s, it need not have ended today. So the motivations is where I'm like a little suspicious.
Dussels motivations or whose
Yeah, I mean,
motivations?
like, I mean, not, yeah, the motivations as in, like, I mean, how much of this also, like, I feel like there's always, like, a little bit of like, for any, so, like, I mean, post-colonized civilization, when you're trying to, like, deal with this, you're always kind of, like, thinking about your own position as the other. So in
Yes,
there,
of course.
like, there is like, you tend to adapt into modernity's frameworks and by
Mhm.
the same logics, like, combat it, right? So,
Right. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, basically, like in the same text, we start off by talking about like the spirit of like Germany and like
Yeah.
what that represents. And rather than like a globalized framework here, like, yeah, I don't know, like, I feel like there's a lot of like a lot of history is excluded in that particular movement.
Yeah.
If
Well,
you're,
I mean, this is a very short essay. If you want the more like Dussel is actually one thing that I cannot criticize Dussel for is being lax with his historical like detail. Because this is a short essay in a short collection for the purposes of this class, it's very protracted. And as you say, it elides so much. But if you want the full meats, there is a much more world historical like tracing of all this process in 3 volumes, which goes back to the origins of Mesopotamian civilization, which is the politics of liberation. And this is where Dussel like sort of painstakingly, almost overwhelmingly, sort of reconstructs this step by step and tries to sort of justify his sort of bigger normative moves. But I totally see that what you're saying, and this is, I mean, what you're saying is not is part of the suspicions that philosophers and historians and sociologists after the liberationist turn will voice, which is that it is a selective and sort of politicized, sort of catered, selective notion of history that, from the perspective of the colonized, tries to position or place a privileged position to the role of Spain, the Mediterranean, the Caribbean in this particular moment in history as the origin of modernity. But this revisionary gesture has been done, time and time again ever since for different regions to say, no, modernity begins with us and the true modernity is this, and therefore the true future is like, whatever. So to what extent is this just like a kind of scholastic trick, or is it just a truly, you know, does it reinvent the way we think? I do think this historiographical recollection of how it is that the reasons why Spain had to sort of like venture right westward in this context are illuminating for someone who is completely oblivious about the geopolitical and mercantile situation of the world circa 1492, around the time of the Reconquista, right? So that's a longer debate, of course, that we can have for the historical and normative reasons you mentioned. But I think it's good that you bring it up, and we will certainly have more to say about it because this keeps coming back in all this
there's like a
historiography.
slight similarity I've also felt. Like, I mean, last year there was someone who was speaking about Pan-Africanism and with Senghor's like philosophy and
Yeah.
what he tried to do politically. Like, I think it was helpful that you use that description. But yeah, what
Yeah,
you try to do politically, and like there's something similar that I'm like sensing here as well. So it doesn't,
yeah,
not
yeah.
a philosophical
Absolutely.
project, it also becomes a political project
Yeah,
for some folks.
yeah. This the search. I mean, it's very much neatly, the kind of populist reason that you find in Laclau. You can sort of extrapolate this metonymically again to think about how it is that colonized subaltern populations sometimes try to position themselves in these different ways as kinds of eventual models and cradles for civilization through these revisionary histories. And that's part of what my book is trying to examine, how Latin America did this. Um, Remaining very agnostic and in fact skeptical about the fact that it certainly did not succeed in doing what it claimed it would, but also, the very motivation has something. Your suspicions I share in many ways, and I think they need to be made explicit, right? Part of what I try to diagnose is this through the ironic way in which these projects of emancipation rely invariably on not only sources but even modes of criticism that come from without, right? And how this is mediated by academic discourse in the Anglo-Saxon world, but not exclusively. So there's a big series of debates there that we're going to get into also. Nia, you have your hand up?
Yeah, hi Daniel. Thanks so much. Really interesting presentation. Yeah, my question just sort of follows on a little bit from the last question, which is about the the origin sort of story in a way, of the colonization with displacement in the sort of geographical sort of navigation, where there's a sort of contingency about the colonization, and as opposed to a sort of an inevitability in some way. And I'm wondering, does this kind of when we speak about the sort of conditions for sort of rationalizing an emancipatory sort of emancipatory movement, I think you were just speaking about that, in terms of, the kind of framing of the colonized subalterns and this revisionary sort of history. But I'm just wondering, does Zell or others after him sort of reconfigure the problem of sort of negative freedom and alienation as a more sort of apparatic sort of, as an apparatic sort of alienation rather than a generative one? And what I'm saying that I'm bringing in the idea of the contingency and inevitability, and that there's something about this displacement in the arrival, and the fact that it's embedded in sort of mercantile exchange as well. There's something, the features of this kind of, revisionist sort of historiographic account. I'm wondering about the kind of conditions then for rationalizing, the movement of emancipation. And something, picking up at one point, you talked about the sort of matrix that maintains the vertical and the horizontal axes, in framing the emancipatory project and the possibility of sort of diagnosing, its, its constraints, that might give it any opening to sort of to freedom.
Yes. So of course, a lot of this hinges on the projective positive project that Dussel is going to sketch out for us, which is and has to do with this transmodern business, and which incorporates a series of vectors from liberationist thought that stand outside of the strictly speaking historiographical and philosophical, but include things like the pedagogy of liberation, the theology of liberation, and the politics of liberation, right? And what does this mean? And this is where the concept of transmodernity comes into play. Now, full disclosure, my own hunch is that transmodernity in this kind of transversal sense, when it was translated actually into an attempt to participate actively in the construction of alternative modes of governance and statecraft and policy, I don't know how much you know, but actually Dussel and others did participate and collaborate in the construction of the constituent assemblies in Venezuela in the Bolivarian Revolution, for example, right? And the whole idea there was to precisely, in continuity with what I have already said, to construct a kind of quote unquote institutional framework that would allow marginalized voices that are not just only quote unquote proletarian voices, the industrialized labor in the unions and trade, but also indigenous groups of feminist struggles, former slaves, Afro-American groups, give them a voice and a representation in the drafting of a new constitution. This became a template in which actually philosophy and sociology and historiography tried to participate. And I guess the big question would be retroactively, how have these experiments played out, right? Like did this kind of like attempt to bring these ideas into fruition really yield anything like a more inclusive, emancipatory movement? And I'm not sure that we're going to have the resources to answer a question as ambitious as that, right? But nevertheless, I think that when you read it at the theoretical level, things come across a little bit thin and platitudinous in the transmodern end of the spectrum. At least that has always been my own hunch. I think this is the price to be paid for the ethical undercurrent or prioritization of ethics that Dussel places in this kind of like messianic, almost theological register that he wants to trace back to the origins of Judeo-Christianity. Anyway, that's a whole thing on its own that I'm not going to get into right now. But I think there are methodological issues that explain the limits of the vision of transmodernity that he elaborates, but transmodernity has been also appropriated, displaced, reconfigured, recast in many ways. And I think we're still in Latin America using that term in ways that are constructive and that are crucially tried or overtly presented as alternatives to what other times says. Dussel began using the term postmodern before it ended up becoming sedimented as what it means today. And then he shuttled to transmodern for precisely those reasons. So there's a longer history here, and there's more to be said about this kind of like, axiological aspect of it. But I think we'll get to talk about that as the more we move forward.
Thank you.
Let me see. Anna says, okay, Ernesto de Clau. Yes, that's well, and also, of course, the critique of populist reason is another very important work by de Clau. So let me just like complete this idea to move forward. It's like, how much time do we have? Oh shit, we're out of time. Wait, we're out of time, or we have one more hour? I always forget what's. We're done.
At the limit, but you can finish.
Okay, I'll finish this idea and then we'll call it a day. Okay, we're almost at the end of what I want to say about the Sase before getting to Quijano. So what I wanted to say is that Dussel here says that the first modernity, the 16th century, is the question: are the Indians men? Do they have any rights? Crucially, by the time we get to the second modernity, the modernity that we learn about, right? The Western Northern modernity, this question has already been answered, right? Because conquest, elimination, the reforms of Charles V, the new laws were not effective. The encomienda system, as you might know, transitioned into el repartimiento, as I mentioned before. El repartimiento did not basically guarantee the abolition of coerced labor. And certainly by the time that the hacienda system came around, which was Bartolomé's own dream, people need to remember this, the situation of the indigenous populations was still, nevertheless, that reduced to serfs and subject to abuses, extermination, basically by decree with no rule or state law to protect them. So what the second modernity already engages with is that this question becomes answered, it's erased, and it engages in a progressive simplification of life. Simplification of life, he means that basically there is this kind of like now basically monolithic conception of subjectivity, of modern life, of that elides this entire complexity that is going on in the colonies and is just simply assumed as universal. And this is the model of modernity that you get in these high quote unquote genealogies and historiographies of Hegel, even Weber, even Marx, that, basically the question of the indigenous subject becomes completely elided at this point. This is a process that Angel Rama has described actually quite well, the simplification of life that was brought about as a kind of necessary corollary of the colonization process already since the beginning, in fact, but that certainly begins to steep off since the 18th century. Anyway, let me just read this final quote and then we'll call it a day. So this is the two modernities that he describes. It's a two-part quote. There are at least two modernities. The first is a Hispanic humanist Renaissance modernity, still linked to the old interregional system of Mediterranean Muslim and Christian, the third stage of the interregional system, right? In this, the management of the new system will be conceived from out of the older paradigm of the interregional system. That is, Spain manages centrality as domination through the hegemony of an integral culture, a language, a religion, Christianity, and thus the evangelization process that Amerindia will suffer. As military occupation, bureaucratic political organization, economic expropriation, demographic presence with hundreds of thousands of Spaniards and Portuguese who forever will inhabit Amerindia, ecological transformation through the modification of fauna and flora, and so on. Notice how this list already coincides with what Quijano, at the beginning of his essay, right, identifies as the different axes of power and the ways in which different concepts of power are correlated to specific institutions: authority, the nation, labor, sex, the family, right? This is the substance of the world empire project, which, as Wallerstein notes, failed with Charles V. Modernity 1. Stage 2. Second, there is a modernity of the Anglo-Germanic Europe, which begins with the Amsterdam of Flanders, and which frequently passes as the only modernity, the Eurocentric interpretation. This is the interpretation of Sombart, Weber, Habermas, and even the postmoderns, who will produce a reductionist fallacy that occludes the meaning of modernity and thus the sense of its contemporary crisis. This second modernity, or this reification, this is crucial for the decolonial theorists, specifically for Mignolo. This idea that this kind of reductionist conception of modernity can, in a certain way, not be ameliorated or revised. The second modernity, to be able to manage the immense world system suddenly opening itself to tiny Holland, which from being a Spanish colony now places itself as the center of the world system, must accomplish or increase its efficacy through simplification. It is necessary to carry out an abstraction favoring the quantum to the detriment of qualitas that leaves out many valid variables: cultural, anthropological, ethical, political, and religious variables, aspects that are valuable even for the European of the 16th century, that will not allow an adequate factual or technologically possible management of the world system. This simplification of complexity encompasses the totality of the life world, Lebenswelt, of the relationship with nature, a new technological and ecological position that is no longer teleological, of subjectivity itself, a new self-understanding of subjectivity and of community, a new intersubjective and political relation. A new economic attitude, practical productive, will now establish itself, capitalism. This is basically a reformulation of the axes that Quijano already identified in The Coloniality of Power, right? This essay is from 1998, remember? Right, so this is already steeped when Dussel has sort of incorporated himself into the decolonial sort of paradigm. So I think this is a good essay because it exists in the interstices between still the philosophy of liberation, right? It's still the representative of and it's also now in the horizon of the decolonial turn. So it's a good place to get this kind of introductory sort of getting of the concept. And finally, there's two questions in the chat. I just wanted to ask, are there any assignments at the end of the course? You're going to be free. You're free to write a final paper if you want, or an article, or a art project, and I'm happy to review that. It's not mandatory for me. It's something that you are free to do. And the second is, does Dussel then claim that the first modernity is mercantilist but not capitalist? He thinks that mercantilism and capitalism are not different, but that the former is a kind of proto-embryonic stage of the latter. That capitalism includes mercantilism as its embryonic stage. Of course, mercantilism is older, but the mercantilism that implies the kind of world trade through a interconnected nexus or world system of the kind described is the beginnings of capitalism proper, despite others like Mariátegui saying that Spain brought us the Middle Ages. Well, here we have an expansive concept, not just of modernity, but obviously of capitalism also, that includes this kind of mercantile network of exchange as part of it. Anyway, that's all the time we have now, but I'm happy to answer any questions or any thoughts that anybody has. Sensa?
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, how are you?
Good to see you.
Long time no see. Good afternoon to everybody. Maybe like just a small comment.
Oh, and sorry, Sensa, just before, if anybody needs to leave, please don't feel ashamed. Like I totally understand we're over time, but I'm happy to just answer to anybody. So Sensa, yeah, sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah, no, it's okay. I get it. I have to leave too, but didn't want to lose my train of thought. Mostly because this seminar is quite related to something that I'm researching with a friend of mine called Karen Monroe Doctrine, which is sort of like the Monroe Doctrine, but through
Yeah, it sounds a lot like the Monroe.
It's really cool. I can send you like a draft. But anyway, I think it has something, it really literally resonates with the title Limits of Decolonial Reason.
Yes.
Initially, I thought this session made me a little bit angry, but then I sort of reflected on that feeling. And I think that it sort of made me angry up until now, even because it sort of reminds me it's curious to see this sort of theoretical framework and school and academic tradition at this point, framed in the new center has something novel. I mean, it is. That's why it makes sense with the course. But yeah. I mean, I guess like you and me and maybe most of the Latin American assistants to this seminar might be familiar with this in the sense of, this whole decolonial train of thought of Universidad Andina, Simón Bolívar. It's like TFW, you are a lefty, South American, and go to college. It's like a starter pack. So yes. It's curious to see it from a different perspective, maybe more mature.
Yes, actually, one of the most important things that I want to, and this will, when we get to Rivera Cosicanqui, obviously, yeah. So one of the most important things that she brings out is this kind of, I think, important rift between the side of decolonial theory that has been flourishing and mostly centered in the American academy, Duke and so on, right? And on the other hand, the experiences, efforts that are much more tied to not only grassroots politics movements in Latin America themselves, but to organized, party politics even, and the sense of like the dangers of the institutionalization and assimilation of decolonial theory into the American academy and discourse, right? Which is, as you probably know, what Rivera Cosicanqui is going to very violently charge Mignolo, Walsh, and their collaborators with. So I think when I talk about the limits of decolonial reason, it's not meant to be a simple, sort of brushing aside, oh, this is the limits of, but precisely what different thinkers within decolonial thought have identified as potential problems with specific iterations of it, right? And also trying to understand what are when we speak of limits, we don't only speak of deficiencies, we speak of what something can do, right? In the Kantian sense, right? The limits of a cognitive faculty determines its powers, not only its, let's say, impossibilities. And so by understanding its historical precursors, the theoretical sources from which it draws, we have a better sense of what the conceptual theoretical machinery can do in its interpretational scope, right? And that's what I, as a philosopher that I am, right? That's what I'm trying to focus on, how it is that these concepts collaborate or construct a hermeneutic framework that is specifically purported to have an epistemological scope or gnosiological scope, right? As we will see. So those are central.
Yeah, no, I get it. Even though I get what you are positing. Like, it is sort of looking robustness within the coordinates of philosophy, which is like an intellectual and cognitive device, one could say historically taken by the West or something like it. Because, you know, there is like this stereotypical idea of pre-Hispanic knowledge or spiritualist philosophy or spiritualist thinking or animistic thinking, which are just like decorated words to say the same, which is philosophy, like modes of thinking.
Sometimes, you know, like Mignolo talks about non-Western gnosis, right? We're going to talk about that. Is that philosophy? It depends. I mean,
even that's the thing. Like, even referring to gnosis, I think it's also not going away from the limits, the epistemological limits given by academia as it is, because it's coming from gnosis, from the Gnostical tradition of
from the Gnostic tradition. Yeah.
So in that sense, I do see that these sort of frameworks have their limit pretty explicit, and it's pretty exoteric, and it is discursive institutions, particularly jurisprudence and academia. And
I'm with you. I agree, and I think that's why something like reading Rivera Cusicanqui is important, even though you can say that she does the same thing in a way. In a certain way, that's something we cannot do without. I mean, the liberationist philosophers thought that by applying themselves to some sort of like the organic intellectual, which was the people, you could get over that, but that was a cheat, of course. But in any case, I think all of these topics are going to be in the platter for debate, so we shouldn't get ahead of ourselves too quickly. But I appreciate really that everything you're saying is absolutely resonant with what we're going to be talking about, and I think we probably agree with more than more things than anything. So yeah, anybody else has any questions? Yes, Douglas.
Yeah, I was interested. So we talked a lot about the kind of universalism of the modernity-coloniality movement, and I was curious to know because we didn't necessarily talk about particularism, and maybe in a way there's a kind of straw man version of post-colonial and decolonial thought that equates it with particularism. But I was sort of interested in, do you know the philosopher Amy Allen and her work?
Yes,
So
I do. But I'm not terribly familiar, but I read a few things. Yeah, like
there was some resonance between. There was some resonance between this what you wrote in the syllabus about rehabilitating the possibility of a modernity without coloniality and a universalism without Eurocentrism. She's kind of trying to put critical theory, especially the Frankfurt School, in dialogue with post-colonial theory, especially kind of like French theory-inspired post-colonial theory. And the way she puts it is to sort of decolonize critical theory, but criticalize post-colonial theory. And I was sort of interested in that sort of second part of that movement, or I mean, like both of them together seem to have, and I'm not as familiar with the genealogy of the modernity-coloniality movement, which seems like in a way it's like the like that gesture, there's some almost version of it already there that has a much deeper intellectual history. But there seems to be a way that is getting at even a similar paradox or contradiction between particularism and universality. That sort of and trying to deal with the kind of broader like philosophical tradition as it both encompasses the kind of European side and kind of like much more kind of rooted decolonial like political struggles and movements and so forth.
Yeah. I mean, that's a difficult one because I Um, so I mean, what can I say about that? I mean, what I can say is that the idea of a kind of like, critical extension or sort of radicalization or iteration of decolonial theory bolstered by the resources of the Frankfurt School seems to me interesting in its own right because all the way back since the philosophy of liberation, Dussel being definitely the most vocal on this regard, he takes the Frankfurt School and Habermas above all as one of his most direct targets, right? Of the kind of framework that he's trying to get, to go after as a target of what he calls a kind of internal critique of European philosophy and culture. And so he's very explicit about positioning the philosophy of liberation and decolonial thought from the peripheries, from the perspective of the oppressed, blah, 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 against that. So, I mean, I'm not, I don't have a horse on that race. Like, I'm more than happy to contemplate the possibility of a more, same with Foucault. Quijano makes a swathing comment that seems to incorporate everything under the umbrella of what post-structuralism, postmodernism means, including the concepts of power that, would come downstream from Foucault. People like Santiago Castro Gomez from Colombia say that's a bad reading of Foucault, and actually using Foucault does a lot of good to get us up, So there's always going to be these kinds of like negotiations based on the sympathies and the theoretical, let's say, alignments of the different thinkers that you're talking about. And the typical academic trickery, or not, maybe not trickery, but like, you say that so and so is wrong, but I'm going to show you how not, because and then there's got to be that Deleuzian guy who comes over, you know how this goes. So there's no shortage of theoretical, let's say, like things in the marketplace, let's say, and I am all for it, like proliferation, but I'm also aware and weary of what Sansa and I think John was also like mentioning, that, like, there is also this kind of like what happens when discourse becomes assimilated, and it becomes, when this kind of discourse, which is purported to have truly a kind of practical political sort of effect, right, becomes simply squandered and assimilated, diluted into academic discourse, and once again becomes this kind of academic, promiscuity of procreation of positions for journals and people to advance careers, right? I find that to be dangerous, right? So I think it's important to also be vigilant of that tendency at the same time, right? As it were. Leonardo said here in UNAM, there's a fierce debate on the validity of both dependency and the decolonial turn because of the failures like Venezuela. That's a big, big, big question, right? We alluded to this earlier when I mentioned that people like Dussel had participated in the construction of like La Asamblea Constituyente in Venezuela and Bolivia. All of this was, like seen at the time as like, yes, right? Like this is happening. This is actually, but where are we now, right? Like, what are the consequences of the Bolivarian Revolution, and how do we like tap that back into its theoretical sources of inspiration, right? Or Garcia Linera was like a very, 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 very sophisticated thinker. Let's put it that way. Anyway, any other thoughts? Oh yeah, John. Sorry, your hand meshed into.
It's also like a little bit about the language, the way that language is employed, right? Like it's kind of, it gives it a sense of like it's not speaking to a context. Like even if you look at the title, like what do you say? The Mignolo book, the what do you global
Global histories, global designs.
local design, and it kind of gives you a sense of it being larger than like a local history. And being a look like what do you say? I encountered decoloniality for the first time in Singapore, and more recently, like I keep catching this Indonesian curatorial collective, like just what do you say, quoting Quijano, like left, right, and center. So the same way that we kind of like, what do you say, no, things might be framed in a certain context, and when we try to like talk about words like modernity, which has a certain like it's not just the idea of like, globalization. Trade relationships have been fairly global in some form or the other since 2000, 3000 years, if you're going to like really start counting it. It's not like a new phenomena, but something very specific happens in modernity if we are giving it a capital M rather than modernity is plural, right?
Mm-hmm.
That has to be centered, in my opinion, where let's say someone like Habermas positions it. It happens, it's got a very specific history.
Mm.
And
Well, I mean, I think that where, how, what's the benchmarks, what's the specificity? I mean, I agree with you. Like there, I mean, any term you can define it however you want, right? But if you want to capture a truly transformative event process like modernity is certainly, you want to not just like simply play hazy and tough to get and just like redefine your terms to, artificially create a research program. But I don't think that Wallerstein's like reconceptualization of the modern concept is that either. I think that he is sufficiently rigorous and expansive and attentive, certainly far more than Habermas ever was, to the actual historiography of not only, the evolution of ideas, but material conditions, the consolidation of markets, labor, trades, the different figures of subjectivity that emerge, but in relation to specific social roles and it's extremely detailed, and so that's why I think one cannot just simply accuse it of being a kind of convenient scapegoat. But there are other less compelling, I think, displacements. Mignolo sometimes, in my opinion, is a little bit too hazy with some of the terminology that he uses. So I think it's a matter of like, negotiating these questions. I mean, you might have a preference for the Habermasian definition for good reasons, but I do think that this is not a terribly transparent question either, right? Like the scholarship here is quite vast, I think,
no,
sufficiently
it's not
vast.
for
Yeah.
sure, but it's also I'm just even in terms of this, just sensitive to what's being excluded. Like the idea of like, if
Mm.
modernity can be spoken, then there's this whole notion about like a pre-European, what I might just simply term gunpowder modernisms of Islamic, like,
Yeah.
which is like kind of like very much cohesively tied in together and
Yeah.
disengaged in global trade.
Mm.
And at its peripheries, it would move into like the American continent as well in some form or the other, maybe not in a documented fashion.
Yeah.
It's my
Yep.
question is how, like, what's the starting point? What is excluded? Like, these are the two questions that I have.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. No, and that's always going to be a question, right? Like regardless of your theoretical framework or your historiography, history is a selective enterprise, right? And definitions are also selective, and they're more encompassing or less encompassing, and to a large extent, I'm not going to say arbitrary, but there are cutting lines, exclusions, inclusions that are based on background factors that are invisible to the reader, that have to do with like the political, ideological orientation or preferences of the reader, the limitations of their knowledge, and all these other factors. So all of that is absolutely up for critique, right? So anything we read is going to or can be subjected to that scrutiny. Yeah, invariably. Yeah, for sure.
It's also under the conditions of like it being consumed in a globalized manner. Like, just to
Mhm.
look at the conditions of how we are discussing these
Yeah.
concepts in this Zoom classroom. Like
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
not.
Yeah. I mean, of course, if we had all the time in the world, we could like, you know, go deep in the historiography of like, the Mediterranean and like the trade in the Atlantic, in the 16th century and spend like, 8 weeks on the to describe, how the Reconquista leads to the financing of the ventures towards or across the Atlantic and the colonization process. I mean, and I've done this in other classes where we work through the early chronicles of the conquest of Cuba, the Caribbean, but everything. But it's like what I want to do for this particular seminar is this kind of examination of the central concepts that orient the epistemological dimension, right, of the project, because there is that underlying coloniality of knowledge part, and I want to examine that part and see where it takes us, right? Giuseppe?
So I wanted to say thank you for this genealogy of Mignolo, because I've read Mignolo before, but this was the first time I actually engaged directly with Keanu. And I found it really interesting that some of the difficulties that I've had with Mignolo in my own particular area of study, which is South Asia, because Mignolo has kind of been expanded to, to sort of deal with colonialism, globally, as well as just specifically in South America. And the thing I find interesting is in Keanu, I noted that there are certain what I would call kind of historical errors. Particularly, I found interesting. It's in the article from Nepantla, where he talks about all regions and populations colonized and incorporated in the New World Market under European dominion basically remained under non-waged relations of labor. And then I thought about the permanent settlement in Bengal, for example, where that definitely wasn't the case, where you had local elites used as kind of intermediaries. You have peasant cultivation with the riots, for example, where there was obviously it was exploitative in the case of the riots, and you could also argue in the case of the local elites. But that for me is sort of it's historically erroneous for him to make that generalization. And I suppose it doesn't matter so much with because I think Keanu was mostly interested in the Latin American context. But I think the problem comes when Mignolo kind of inflates that, and I think it's only natural for like North American academia to kind of focus in on what Mignolo is saying, because again, from the articles that we read this week, I kind of noticed that there were lots of parallels between North American decolonization and South American decolonization that from my kind of British South Asian kind of angle I hadn't thought of before. I'd be interested later on in the seminar to find out more about where things are going sort of now that we've kind of gone past a certain period of the decolonial turn, like how these things are being solved within Latin American philosophy itself.
Yeah, and there's no simple answer to that because it's an ongoing thing. But just to answer to one thing, and we are going to have to close shop because I'm abusing the courtesy of the organizers now. So just what you mentioned about historical inaccuracies that occur when, say, for example, Mignolo extrapolates from the concrete analysis of Latin America, say, to other regions of the world. This happens already at the outset of the decolonial turn. Quijano himself makes historical mistakes. In the essay we read, for example, he describes that under Charles V, the encomienda system was banned, and that this was the beginning of the outlawing of forced or coerced labor, of indigenous labor. That was not true. The encomienda was not banned as such. It was regulated and it changed into a repartimiento system, but coerced labor still persisted. And, in Latin America, we have a saying called el papel aguanta todo, which means you can have a law that says something and, you can still have things going on. So the idea that, Charles V passed the new laws and then we transitioned from the encomienda system to a new hacienda system, gross simplification of history, that this begins the kind of like slow transition to the modern wage salaried labor of like bourgeois, like civilization of modernity. That's also complete fabrication. There's a lot of historical inaccuracies, and that's what happens when you have people that are trying to do these like kind of grand narratives, right? And that's a price to be paid that I think I'm willing to pay, which is that if there's going to be somebody writing these big stories, right? Like you can stay forever writing like micro histories of this or that, but the big stories have to be written, and invariably those are going to come with like that kind of gloss, right? And that kind of like falling of that. And it's up to us to, okay, correct it, figure out where it went wrong. But the big narratives are there should be there also, I think, always. Maybe some people like Lyotard and say, no, big narratives, goodbye. No, let's just do small stuff, specialization only. But I'm a philosopher. I like my systems. I like I like my macro narratives. God damn it. Okay, sorry for keeping, half an hour. Sorry, Jesus. I appreciate your attention and time. I apologize to Luis. Are you there, Luis? Maybe not. Okay, well, so that's it for today. Thank you all. I'll see you next week. We'll talk about Quijano and Mignolo next time. Okay, great. See you.